Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the whimsical world of Albert Einstein, a genius's journey where you'll discover he once failed an entrance exam, proving even the brightest minds can stumble on the path to brilliance. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the sleepy town of Ulm, Germany, where the most exciting event might have been a particularly lively farmer's market, a baby named Albert Einstein was born on March 14, 1879. No one in Ulm could have guessed that this infant, who looked as ordinary as a loaf of bread, would one day change the face of physics forever. But before we get to the universe-altering equations and Nobel Prizes, let's dive into the less glamorous, decidedly more relatable saga of young Albert's life. Spoiler alert, it involves a lot more awkwardness and a lot less immediate genius than the legend suggests. To kick things off, let's talk about the infamous speech delay. Einstein didn't start speaking until he was nearly 3 years old. For a while, the family probably wondered if he'd ever form a coherent sentence. When he finally did, legend has it that he didn't just start with a word or two, but instead delivered full sentences like a pint-sized philosopher. Although this story has been spiced up over the years, the truth is, young Albert was simply a late bloomer. This slow start in communicating earned him the nickname, the dopey one from family members, which, let's be honest, is the kind of family lore that makes Thanksgiving dinners awkwardly delightful for generations. Fast forward to the time when Einstein was a teenager. Here's a fun tidbit. He wasn't born with a calculus book in his hand. In fact, in 1895, at the tender age of 16, he applied to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. The result? Rejection. And no, it wasn't because he failed math. He actually aced those parts. The irony of the situation is that his scores in the non-scientific subjects were the real culprits. Languages and history, it seems, were not exactly his forte. So yes, the guy who would later untangle the mysteries of the cosmos couldn't quite get a handle on French grammar. It's a comforting thought for anyone who's ever balmed a language class. Now, if you've heard that Einstein was a terrible student, it's time to debunk that myth. Contrary to popular belief, Einstein was far from a classroom disaster. In fact, he was quite the opposite. He excelled in subjects that piqued his curiosity, science and mathematics, surprise, surprise, and often outperformed his peers. The real issue wasn't his intellect, but rather his disdain for rote learning and rigid structures. He didn't care much for memorizing facts or regurgitating information, which put him at odds with the educational system of the time. Basically, Einstein was the original rebel with a cause, long before James Dean made it cool. Einstein's academic challenges were less about ability and more about fit. Picture a square peg in a round hole. Only this peg understood the intricacies of electromagnetic fields. His teachers often mistook his rebellious questioning for insolence. But let's face it, if Galileo and Newton had been content with the status quo, we'd still be explaining thunder as the gods bowling in the sky. So, while young Albert's constant questioning might have been annoying to some of his teachers, it was this very curiosity that laid the groundwork for his later breakthroughs. And speaking of breakthroughs, let's not forget the influence of his family. Both his father Hermann and his uncle Jakob were electricians, and they ran an electrical engineering company that, unfortunately, wasn't exactly the apple of its time. Still, growing up in this environment exposed young Albert to the wonders of science and technology. Electricity was the family business, and as a kid, Einstein was fascinated by it. There's a tale about how his father gave him a compass when he was 5, and the young boy was mesmerized by the invisible forces at play. That compass was like a spark that lit the flame of curiosity in Einstein's young mind, setting him on a path to unravel the mysteries of the universe. Einstein's childhood was not filled with the kind of events that make for riveting TV dramas, but it was precisely this mix of awkwardness, curiosity, and rebellion that shaped the man he would become. It's a reminder that the road to genius is often paved with mundane realities and more than a few missteps. So, the next time someone tells you that Einstein failed math, you can chuckle and say, actually, he failed French. And as we continue this journey through his life, remember, even the most legendary figures were once just kids trying to find their place in the world, often getting it wrong before they got it spectacularly right. So, the next time someone tells you that Einstein failed math, you can chuckle and say, actually, he failed French. But let's roll the film forward to the main feature, Einstein's academic escapades and his legendary miracle year of 1905. By then, Einstein had swapped the Swiss Federal Polytechnic for the patent office in Bern, a job that screamed 9 to 5 and mundane more than genius at work. Yet, it was precisely here, amidst stacks of technical papers and a decidedly unglamorous desk, that Einstein pulled a scientific rabbit out of his hat, not once, but 4 times. But before we get to the miracle year, let's set the stage. Einstein finally got into the Swiss Polytechnic on his second try, in 1896. He graduated in 1900, but instead of leaping into a professorship, he found himself job hunting with all the enthusiasm of a teenager applying for their first retail gig. Academic positions were scarce, and Einstein's reputation for challenging authority didn't exactly make him the faculty's favorite candidate. After bouncing from one temporary teaching post to another, he finally landed the patent office job in 1902. And while it might not have been Einstein's dream job, it had one major perk, a predictable workload that allowed him plenty of free time to ponder the mysteries of the universe. Now, let's talk about 1905, the year Einstein became the scientific equivalent of a rock star. Working as a patent clerk by day, he moonlighted as a physicist by night. Picture it, a 26-year-old, not yet the iconic wild-haired figure of later years, but instead a young man with a neat mustache and a relentless curiosity. In just 1 year, he published 4 groundbreaking papers in the Annalen der Physik, each one enough to make your average scientist's career. First up, his paper on the photoelectric effect. This wasn't just Einstein playing with photons, it was a demolition job on classical physics. He proposed that light could be thought of as discrete packets of energy, or quanta, a notion that would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in 1921. This paper wasn't just a new chapter. It was a plot twist that introduced the world to quantum theory, reshaping the way we understand light and energy. Next, there was his work on Brownian motion. By explaining the erratic movement of particles in a fluid, Einstein provided empirical evidence for the existence of atoms and molecules. This was a big deal because, believe it or not, the idea of atoms was still on shaky ground at the time. His findings not only silenced skeptics, but also laid the groundwork for statistical physics. Then there was the special theory of relativity, the one that would make high school physics students groan for generations. Einstein proposed that the laws of physics are the same for all non-accelerating observers, and that the speed of light is constant regardless of the observer's frame of reference. This was revolutionary, a bit like telling everyone that the Earth isn't the center of the universe. Again, the theory overturned centuries of accepted physics and redefined concepts of space and time. It was the intellectual equivalent of flipping the Monopoly board and declaring new rules. And let's not forget the piece de resistance, E equals mc2. This deceptively simple equation showed that mass and energy are interchangeable. Who knew that a few symbols scribbled on a piece of paper could capture the imagination of physicists and spark debates that are still raging over a century later? While these papers were busy turning the scientific world on its head, Einstein was still punching the clock at the patent office, reviewing designs for electrical gadgets and mechanical doohickeys. It's a classic tale of the underdog outsmarting the academic elite, and let's face it, who doesn't love an underdog story? But it's crucial to remember that Einstein didn't do this in a vacuum. He was part of a vibrant intellectual scene in Bern, meeting regularly with a group of friends they dubbed the Olympia Academy. They discussed everything from philosophy to physics, providing the intellectual camaraderie that Einstein thrived in. Economically, this was also a time of rapid technological advancement and industrial growth, which dovetailed with Einstein's own interests in electricity and mechanics. The world was changing, and Einstein's theories reflected a new understanding of the universe that was as radical as the technological changes happening around him. Despite the revolutionary nature of his work, recognition didn't come overnight. The academic world was slow to acknowledge a patent clerk's contributions, and Einstein's ideas were initially met with skepticism. But slowly, the significance of his work began to sink in. By 1909, he was finally offered a full-time academic position at the University of Zurich. It was as if the scientific community collectively realized they had a diamond in the rough, and they were finally ready to polish it. Einstein's miracle year wasn't just a fluke. It was the culmination of years of curiosity, intellectual rigor, and a willingness to question the status quo. It's a reminder that sometimes genius isn't about being in the right place at the right time, but rather making the most of where you are, even if it's a desk at the patent office. And as we continue to unravel the tapestry of Einstein's life, we can see how this period set the stage for everything that followed, leaving the story deliciously unfinished for now. As the dust settled on Einstein's miracle year, the world was slowly waking up to the fact that the universe was a bit more bendy than anyone had previously thought. Fast forward a few years to 1919, when a particular solar eclipse was about to catapult Einstein from the niche world of theoretical physics to the celebrity stratosphere, turning him into the scientific equivalent of a rock star. Imagine the hype train rolling into town with all the subtlety of a marching band and Einstein, the reluctant conductor, trying to maintain his composure amidst the chaos. Now, let's set the stage. The year is 1919, and the world is still nursing a hangover from World War I. People needed something to believe in, something that wasn't rationed or bombed out of existence. Enter the solar eclipse of May 29, 1919, a celestial event that was set to test Einstein's theory of general relativity. The theory proposed that massive objects like the sun could warp space-time, bending the path of light. To prove it, you needed an eclipse, a clear sky, and a whole lot of patience. Enter Sir Arthur Eddington, a British astronomer with more than just a passing interest in Einstein's work. Eddington organized expeditions to the island of Principe off the coast of Africa and to Sabral in Brazil, aiming to capture the stars near the sun, which would be visible only during the eclipse. The idea was to measure how much the starlight bent as it grazed the sun, and here's the kicker. If Einstein was right, the light would bend just enough to confirm his theory. When the eclipse finally happened, Eddington and his team snapped their photos, and back in the lab, they developed the images with the precision of a watchmaker. The results: the starlight bent exactly as Einstein predicted. Boom! The scientific community was floored, as if they'd just witnessed the moonwalking of theoretical physics. And just like that, Einstein became a household name. Newspapers worldwide splashed his face across front pages with headlines screaming, "Revolution in Science," and "Newton overthrown." The London Times even ran a headline declaring, "Lights all askew in the heavens." It was as if Einstein had pulled a cosmic rabbit out of a hat. Everyone wanted a front row seat to the magic show. But here's where things get a bit awkward for our boy Albert. Einstein wasn't exactly the type who relished the spotlight. His hair was wild, his clothes were often a couple of sizes too big, and his disdain for small talk was legendary. Yet here he was, thrust into the limelight like a 20th century influencer without the Instagram account. The media frenzy was intense. Journalists were camped outside his door, and lectures were so packed that people were hanging from the rafters just to catch a glimpse of the man who had dared to challenge Newton. While the world was busy putting Einstein on a pedestal, he was grappling with the uncomfortable reality of being a public figure. Sure, he enjoyed the recognition, but the pressure was immense. It's one thing to be a genius in the quiet of your own mind. It's quite another to have the entire world watching your every move, expecting the next big breakthrough. And let's not forget the toll it took on his personal life. Einstein's marriage to Milva Marick had already seen better days, and the newfound fame did little to patch up a relationship that was fraying at the seams. Meanwhile, the socio-political landscape was shifting like tectonic plates. By the early 1930s, the ominous clouds of nazism were gathering over Germany. Einstein, a Jew and a vocal pacifist, became a target for anti-Semitic attacks and propaganda. The rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933 was the final straw. Einstein, who had been abroad when Hitler became Chancellor, decided it was time to bid adieu to his homeland. He renounced his German citizenship, and in a move that would change the course of his life, accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Einstein's move to the United States wasn't just a geographical shift. It was a leap into a new world of academic freedom and opportunity. But let's not romanticize it too much. The decision was driven by necessity as much as by choice. Germany was no longer safe for someone like Einstein, whose Jewish heritage and outspoken political views put him at odds with the Nazi regime. Arriving in the U.S., Einstein found a nation grappling with the Great Depression. The economic landscape was one of unemployment lines and soup kitchens, a far cry from the glittering lights of New York City that greeted ocean liners arriving from Europe. Yet, in this land of contradictions, Einstein found a new home. The Institute at Princeton offered him the intellectual sanctuary he so craved, a place where he could ponder the universe without the shadow of political oppression. But even in the academic haven of Princeton, Einstein couldn't entirely escape his celebrity status. He was both revered and at times misunderstood. The man who had once been dubbed the dopey one by his family was now America's favorite genius, a living symbol of intellect and curiosity. Yet, as he settled into his new life, Einstein remained acutely aware of the world's ills. He used his fame as a platform to advocate for civil rights, pacifism, and scientific responsibility, speaking out against racism and the arms race. It's a testament to his character that even as he navigated the complexities of fame and politics, Einstein never lost sight of his true passion, the relentless pursuit of knowledge. His move to the United States marked not just a new chapter in his life, but also a new phase in the story of science, a tale of ideas that transcended borders and cultures, bringing the world closer to understanding the universe's mysteries. And as we leave Einstein in Princeton, surrounded by books and blackboards, remember that the story is far from over. There are still more equations to be written, more myths to debunk, and more universes to explore. So stay tuned, because the adventure is just beginning. And so, nestled in the academic cocoon of Princeton, Einstein's life continued to unfold like the most unpredictable of equations. You see, even as he was solving the cosmos mysteries, the world outside was gearing up for a more terrestrial kind of explosion. It's the late 1930s, and across the Atlantic, the ominous rumblings of World War II were starting to sound like a bad sequel nobody wanted. Now, one of the most jaw-dropping plot twists in Einstein's life was his role in the creation of the atomic bomb, a weapon so destructive it made the medieval catapult look like a kid's slingshot. But how did a pacifist like Einstein end up being associated with something that could wipe out cities? That's where our story gets a little, well, nuclear. Einstein, with his unruly hair and aversion to socks, wasn't exactly the obvious choice for a military advisor. But in 1938, German physicists discovered nuclear fission, the process that could potentially create a bomb of unimaginable power. Cue the entrance of Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, who saw the potential for catastrophe if Nazi Germany developed this technology first. Szilard needed someone with enough clout to get the attention of the U.S. government, and Einstein, with his celebrity scientist status, was the perfect candidate. In 1939, Szilard and fellow physicists Eugene Wigner and Edward Teller visited Einstein in his summer home on Long Island. They explained the dire situation, and Einstein, ever the reluctant warrior, agreed to sign a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This letter warned of the potential for extremely powerful bombs of a new type and urged the U.S. to accelerate its own research. The letter, dated August 2, 1939, would later be known as the Einstein-Szilard letter, and it was the catalyst for what would become the Manhattan Project. But let's not paint Einstein as the mastermind behind the bomb. He later expressed deep regret over his role in the letter, famously saying, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made." His intentions were driven by the fear of Nazi Germany getting there first, a classic case of choosing the lesser of two evils, or at least the lesser of two potential mushroom clouds. And speaking of mushroom clouds, the Manhattan Project was a gargantuan effort, costing about $2 billion, that's roughly $30 billion today, in case you're tallying inflation-adjusted nightmares. It involved over 130,000 people and facilities across the U.S., from New Mexico to Washington. All this from a letter that Einstein had scribbled on a piece of paper in a quiet summer retreat. Einstein, meanwhile, was not directly involved in the project. In fact, the U.S. government considered him a security risk. He was a pacifist with connections to leftist organizations, after all. Instead, he continued his work at Princeton, where he tried in vain to develop a unified field theory, the holy grail of physics that would tie together all the forces of nature. But let's face it, not even Einstein could solve everything. For Einstein, the end of the war brought mixed emotions. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were a grim confirmation that his fears were justified, and his name became inextricably linked with the atomic age, a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had fought for peace. In a twist of irony so profound it could have been scripted by the universe itself, Einstein, the pacifist, was now a symbol of atomic power. Away from the grand stage of world events, Einstein's personal life was a tapestry of quirks and eccentricities. For starters, he had an aversion to socks. Yes, socks. The man who could unravel the fabric of space-time found them uncomfortable and unnecessary. He once quipped, "When I was young, I found out that the big toe always ends up making a hole in a sock. So I stopped wearing socks." And let's not forget his love for sailing. Einstein adored being on the water, despite the minor detail that he couldn't swim. Picture him, a genius adrift in a small sailboat named Tumla, navigating the waters with more enthusiasm than skill, a metaphor for his approach to life itself. Einstein's later years were marked by a return to his roots as a vocal pacifist and advocate for civil rights. He was an outspoken critic of McCarthyism and racism, famously calling racism America's worst disease. He was a member of the NAACP and maintained a friendship with W.E.B. Du Bois, even offering to testify on his behalf during Du Bois's trial for being an unregistered foreign agent. Yet, as the Cold War set in, Einstein's voice became one among many in the chorus warning of nuclear annihilation. He supported the formation of an international government to prevent conflict, but such idealism was a hard sell in a world divided by iron curtains and ideological schisms. The man who had helped warn the world of nuclear power's potential was now trying to put the genie back in the bottle, a task as Sisyphean as it sounds. Even in his twilight years, Einstein never stopped questioning, never stopped searching for answers. He spent his final days in Princeton, working until he could no longer hold a pen. On April 17, 1955, he experienced an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and despite surgical options, he declined, saying, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." Einstein passed away on April 18, 1955, leaving behind a legacy as tangled and fascinating as the universe he sought to understand. His brain was famously removed without permission for study, a macabre tribute to the mind that had changed everything. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Einstein comes not from his equations or theories, but from his own words. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. As we wrap up this chapter of Einstein's life, remember that the story is far from over. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we'll delve into the legacy he left behind, a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the universe and our place within it. So here we are, at the grand finale of Einstein's life story, a tale so rich with intrigue it could make a soap opera look like a dull Tuesday. The question we're left pondering is, what's the real legacy of Albert Einstein? Was he the quintessential absent-minded professor, or was there more to him than meets the eye? Let's unravel the myth from the man, shall we? First off, let's address the elephant in the room, the absent-minded professor trope. Sure, Einstein had a penchant for forgetting the little things, like where he left his keys, or, that he wasn't wearing matching shoes. But this caricature of a scatterbrained genius wandering around with his head in the clouds is only half the story. Beneath the wild hair and the slightly disheveled wardrobe was a mind as sharp as a tack, relentlessly probing the universe's deepest mysteries. The man was a walking paradox, organized chaos personified. While he might have struggled with daily trivialities, His brain was a finely tuned instrument for ideas that rocked the very core of scientific understanding. Einstein's impact on science is, well, astronomical. His theories didn't just tweak the rules of physics, they flipped the entire playbook. The special theory of relativity redefined concepts of space and time, while general relativity bent those concepts into a shape that even Salvador Dali would have found surreal. His work laid the groundwork for quantum mechanics, a field that's given us everything from smartphones to the eerie possibility of parallel universes where you might be a rock star. And let's not forget his contribution to the photoelectric effect, which was like handing over the keys to the kingdom of quantum physics. If you're into tech, thank Einstein the next time your GPS doesn't send you off a cliff. It's his theories that help make satellite navigation possible. But it wasn't just science that felt the tremors of Einstein's genius. His influence seeped into the very fabric of pop culture. From posters on teenage walls to cameos in everything from The Simpsons to Star Trek, Einstein became the ultimate symbol of intellectual cool. His iconic image, think wild hair, bushy mustache, and that playful twinkle in his eye, has been plastered on everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs. He's the rock star of the science world, and let's face it, probably the only physicist whose face you'd recognize in a crowd. Now, we can't talk about Einstein without mentioning his humanitarian efforts. The man was a one-man orchestra of advocacy, championing causes that ranged from civil rights to nuclear disarmament. He wasn't just a theoretical physicist. He was a moral philosopher who used his platform to speak out against the injustices of his time. Einstein once said, "I have no special talent. I am only passionately curious." But that curiosity wasn't limited to the cosmos. It extended to the human condition. He was a vocal opponent of fascism and war, using his fame to advocate for peace and understanding in a world teetering on the brink of destruction. Einstein's commitment to social justice was as relentless as his pursuit of scientific truth. He was a member of the NAACP and a supporter of civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois. In a country grappling with segregation and racial inequality, Einstein didn't just pay lip service to the cause. He actively participated, attending meetings and offering support where it was needed. He famously hosted Marian Anderson, the celebrated African-American singer, at his home when she was denied a hotel room in Princeton due to her race. It's these acts of quiet rebellion that paint a fuller picture of the man behind the myth, a man who wasn't content to merely change the way we see the universe, but also how we see each other. And let's not gloss over his quirks, those delightful eccentricities that made him a beloved figure beyond his scientific achievements. Take his aversion to socks, for instance. It's almost as if he decided that if he could unravel the universe's secrets, he could certainly do without such mundane constraints. Or his love for sailing despite his inability to swim, a perfect metaphor for his fearless exploration of the unknown. These little oddities made him relatable, reminder that even the greatest minds have their endearing foibles. So what would Einstein think of his iconic status today? Would he be amused, bemused, or just plain confused? It's impossible to say, but one thing's for sure. Einstein didn't set out to become an icon. He was a man driven by a deep-seated curiosity, a desire to understand the universe and our place within it. His fame was an unintended consequence of a life devoted to discovery and truth. In the end, Einstein's legacy is a tapestry woven from the threads of scientific revolution, humanitarian conviction, and an ineffable charm that captured the world's imagination. He challenged us to question, to seek, and to never be satisfied with the status quo. Whether grappling with the equations of relativity or advocating for a more just society, Einstein embodied the spirit of inquiry that defines the best of humanity. As we close the book on Einstein's story, let's remember his words. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. In a world that sometimes seems more bewildering than ever, that's advice worth taking to heart. Whether pondering the mysteries of the universe or the complexities of human nature, let's keep asking questions. Who knows what answers we might find, or what new questions we might uncover. And perhaps, in that endless quest for understanding, we'll find our own way to leave a mark on the world, just as Einstein did. It's a peculiar thing, isn't it? Some people spring from the womb with a silver spoon, while others, like Alexander Hamilton, enter the world with barely a wooden one. Born on January 11, 1755, or maybe 1757, because even birth years were a bit of a guessing game back then. Hamilton arrived on the island of Nevis, smack in the middle of the Caribbean. Imagine this, an island smaller than most U.S. counties, and yet it gave us one of the most influential figures in American history. Talk about punching above your weight. Young Alex had a bit of a rough start. His father, James Hamilton, was a Scottish trader who had the financial acumen of a leaky boat. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was married to another man when Alexander was born, giving complicated family dynamics a new meaning. James Hamilton skipped town when Alex was just a kid, leaving Rachel to fend for herself and her two sons. Tragically, she died of a fever when Alex was around 11, leaving him an orphan. Not exactly the makings of a future founding father, right? But wait, there's more. Despite these chaotic beginnings, Hamilton had something nobody could ignore, an intellect sharper than a pirate's cutlass. By the age of 14, he was working at a local trading firm, Beekman and Kruger, dealing with ships and cargo like a tiny maritime mogul. He wrote a letter so impressively articulate, chronicling a hurricane, no less, that local bigwigs pooled their resources to send him to the American colonies for an education. Imagine that, a teenager riding himself out of poverty with a quill and ink. In 1773, he landed in Boston, where he must have felt like a fish out of water, or perhaps a Caribbean fish in a New England pond. From there, he made his way to New York City and enrolled in King's College, now known as Columbia University. Getting into King's College in the 18th century was akin to winning the educational lottery. But Hamilton wasn't just any student. He was a whirlwind of ideas and ambition. He was the kind of guy who, if he were alive today, would be running multiple startups while simultaneously debating policy on Twitter. Hamilton's time at King's College was cut short by events slightly larger than him, namely, the American Revolution. But before we get to the part where he becomes a war hero and political heavyweight, let's pause to appreciate the audacity of it all. Here was a young man who had every reason to fade into obscurity, yet he propelled himself from a tropical island to the heart of colonial America. It's the stuff of legend, sure, but also a testament to the raw power of human resilience and ambition. Now, let's talk economics for a second. The Caribbean islands in the 18th century were sugar gold mines, driven by brutal slave labor and controlled by a handful of powerful families. Nevis, where Hamilton grew up, was no different. It's a grim backdrop for childhood, but it also gave him a close-up view of wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness. These early experiences would shape his views on economics and government, making him a fierce advocate for a strong central government later in life, a topic for another episode of Hamilton's greatest hits. But back to young Alexander. When he wasn't studying or stirring up revolutionary fervor, he was busy networking. Hamilton understood the value of connections, like a modern-day LinkedIn guru. He charmed his way into the circles of prominent New Yorkers, including future President George Washington. That's right, even before he hit his 20s, Hamilton was rubbing elbows with the bigwigs. It's as if he had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, or perhaps he just created his own luck. His writing skills were not just for stormy weather reports. It became his ticket to influence. Pamphlets, essays, letters. Hamilton churned them out with the fervor of a keyboard warrior, making a name for himself as a staunch critic of British rule. In 1774, he penned a series of essays defending the colonial cause, showing an uncanny ability to wield words like weapons. The Farmer Refuted was one of his early hits, taking on a loyalist named Samuel Seabury with arguments as sharp as his wit. For a young man who started out with nothing but a pen and a penchant for dramatic prose, it was quite the rise. As he transitioned from student to soldier, Hamilton's early setbacks seemed to fuel his relentless drive. He was like an 18th century Energizer bunny, never stopping, always moving forward. His early life was a lesson in turning adversity into opportunity, hardship into strength. So next time you're feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges, just remember, if a Caribbean orphan can become one of America's most influential founding fathers, maybe there's hope for the rest of us yet. As we pivot from the bustling streets of New York to the battlefields of the Revolutionary War, Hamilton's story takes a turn that would make any Hollywood screenwriter's head spin. But hold on. Before you picture him as a musket-wielding action hero, let's set the record straight. Hamilton's war experience was less about dramatic charges and more about the kind of strategic thinking that would put modern corporate strategists to shame. In 1775, with the colony's simmering tensions reaching a boiling point, Hamilton took up arms quite literally. He joined a New York militia company, the Hearts of Oak, where he quickly demonstrated that his brain was his most powerful weapon. His natural leadership and knack for organization led to his promotion as an artillery captain. You might think this is where the cannonballs start flying, but Hamilton's artillery command was more about logistics than loud bangs. He was the guy making sure the ammunition was where it needed to be, when it needed to be there. Not glamorous, perhaps, but crucial. His big break came in 1777 when he caught the eye of none other than General George Washington. Washington, who had a keen eye for talent, saw something in Hamilton that many others missed. Perhaps it was his ability to write with the precision of a sniper and the flair of a Broadway playwright. Or maybe it was his relentless drive and intellect. Whatever it was, Hamilton soon found himself appointed as Washington's aide-de-camp. Now, for those unfamiliar with 18th century military lingo, that meant he was essentially Washington's right-hand man, his chief of staff, if you will. Hamilton's role as aide-de-camp was less about battlefield glory and more about the unglamorous slog of military administration. He wrote countless letters and reports, sometimes churning out over 20 pages in a single night. His pen was mightier than any sword, crafting orders and strategies that kept the Continental Army moving forward. Think of him as the original work-from-home warrior, except his office was a tent, and his desk was probably a makeshift table under a tree. Now, let's debunk a bit of the romanticism around this period. While Hamilton was in the thick of things, he wasn't leading charges with a saber in hand. His battlefield was the writing desk, where he orchestrated the chaos of war with ink and parchment. Sure, he saw combat occasionally, like at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, but his true genius lay in his ability to think strategically and communicate effectively. Hamilton's relationship with Washington was a fascinating dynamic. Washington, the towering figure of the Revolution, was the kind of boss who knew how to play to his team's strengths. He delegated responsibility to Hamilton, trusting him with everything from troop movements to delicate political negotiations. This trust wasn't misplaced. Hamilton had a knack for seeing the bigger picture, understanding that battles weren't won by brute force alone, but by outthinking the enemy. Behind the scenes, Hamilton was also dealing with the harsh realities of war. The Continental Army was often underfunded, underfed, and underwhelmed by their own odds. Hamilton witnessed firsthand the logistical nightmares of keeping an army on the move. Supplies were scarce, and morale was often lower than a snake's belly. Yet, through it all, Hamilton's tireless work helped keep the army from collapsing under its own weight. One of the most telling episodes of Hamilton's wartime service was his involvement in the Yorktown campaign of 1781, the grand finale of the Revolutionary War. Here, Hamilton did get a taste of the action. He led an assault on Redoubt 10, a critical British defensive position, and did so with the kind of flair that would make any action hero envious. But let's be real. It was a small part of a much larger operation, and the real victory was in the planning and coordination that led to the British surrender. Hamilton's war years were a masterclass in turning chaos into order. He learned to navigate the complex web of military politics, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought with words rather than weapons. The war taught him the value of a strong, centralized command, a lesson he would carry into his later political career with fervor. So, while we can appreciate the romantic allure of the dashing young officer, the truth is that Hamilton's real superpower was his brain. He wasn't the swashbuckling hero charging into battle. He was the strategist, the planner, the man behind the curtain, ensuring that the revolution didn't crumble into anarchy. And perhaps that's an even more heroic story, one that shows the true grit and intellect required to shape a nation. As we leave Hamilton in the war-torn colonies, poised on the brink of independence, remember this: his story is just getting started. The revolution was only the beginning for Hamilton, a prelude to the political battles that would define his legacy. But for now, let's savor the irony. While others were fighting for freedom with muskets, Hamilton was doing it with a pen. And so, with muskets silenced, and the ink barely dry on the Treaty of Paris, Hamilton swapped his military uniform for the less glamorous but infinitely more impactful role of economic architect. Now, if you think the Revolutionary War was a chaotic mess, wait until you get a load of the post-war financial landscape. Picture this, a fledgling nation, knee-deep in debt, with each state stubbornly clutching its purse, strings like a toddler refusing to share their toys. Yes, the United States was effectively a financial train wreck waiting to happen. Enter Hamilton, with a plan so ambitious it would make today's Wall Street wizards sweat. In 1789, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, he faced a national debt of about $54 million, not counting the $25 million owed by the states. To put it into perspective, that would be like discovering your new credit card has a balance that rivals a small country's GDP. But Hamilton, ever the pragmatist, saw this debt as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. His solution: assume the state debts at the federal level, thereby centralizing financial power and hopefully earning the young nation some much-needed credibility. Cue the drama. Hamilton's debt plan was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party. Opposition came hard and fast, led by none other than Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They feared it would give the federal government too much power, because who doesn't love a good power struggle? Yet, Hamilton, with all the finesse of a seasoned poker player, managed to push his plan through Congress in 1790, thanks to a backroom deal that would make any political thriller proud. He traded the location of the nation's capital, moving it to the Potomac River, for support on his debt plan. It was a classic case of "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine," with the stakes set at a nation's future. But Hamilton wasn't done making economic waves. He established the first Bank of the United States in 1791, a move that was about as controversial as pineapple on pizza. His vision was a centralized bank that could issue currency, hold government funds, and offer commercial loans. This was revolutionary, or perhaps counter-revolutionary, depending on who you ask. It was a bold stroke aimed at stabilizing the economy, but also one that fed the flames of an already heated debate about states' rights versus federal power. Then came the whiskey tax, a fiscal maneuver so infamous it deserves its own ballad. In 1791, Hamilton proposed an excise tax on whiskey to help pay off the national debt. Simple, right? Not so fast. This tax hit Western farmers, who often distilled their grain into whiskey harder than a bouncer at a speakeasy. It sparked the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, where disgruntled Pennsylvanians decided that tar and feathering tax officials was the best way to express their displeasure. George Washington himself had to lead troops to quell the uprising, proving that sometimes the pen might need a little backup from the sword. This brings us to the myth of Hamilton, the economic genius. Sure, he was brilliant, but genius. Maybe not infallible. His policies did stabilize and lay the foundation for modern American capitalism. They also sowed the seeds of division. His vision of a strong central government was not universally loved. Many saw him as overstepping his bounds, a kind of financial autocrat in a republic's clothing. His knack for stirring the pot was legendary, and his policies often ignited more fireworks than a 4th of July celebration. Hamilton's economic legacy is like a finely aged whiskey, complex, with a hint of bitterness. He was a man who thrived on conflict, often engaging in political battles with the same vigor he once had for military strategy. He was a polarizing figure, revered and reviled in equal measure. But whatever your take on him, his role in shaping the United States financial system is undeniable. He laid the groundwork for a nation that could stand on its own 2 feet, financially at least, and set the stage for its rise to global prominence. As we leave Hamilton juggling the fiery hoops of economic policy, let's not forget the human element. Behind the ledger sheets and tax plans was a man driven by an unyielding belief in the American experiment. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was a visionary who dared to dream big, even if it meant ruffling a few feathers or entire flocks along the way. And with that, we move to Hamilton's next chapter, where personal and political intrigue intertwine like a Baroque opera, but with more duels and fewer areas. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. As we shift gears from Hamilton's fiscal juggling act to the personal drama that would make even Marie Kondo's head spin, let's wade through the messy, scandal-ridden swamp of his personal life. Enter Maria Reynolds, stage left. If Hamilton's life were a Netflix series, this is where you'd hit the next episode, button faster than you can say, Federalist Papers. In the summer of 1791, Hamilton, then Secretary of the Treasury and the poster boy for financial reform, found himself entangled in an affair with Maria Reynolds. She was 23, married, and about as unhappy as a cat in a bathtub. Maria approached Hamilton under the guise of needing financial assistance. Her husband, James Reynolds, was allegedly abusing her and had left her destitute. Cue the world's smallest violin. Hamilton, ever the knight in shining armor, or perhaps just a man caught in a classic midlife crisis, agreed to help. But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't just charity work. Soon, the relationship morphed from monetary aid to a full-blown affair, one that would make any soap opera writer jealous. Over the course of their dalliance, Hamilton forked over around $1,000 to Maria and her husband. In today's money, that's roughly $30,000, a hefty sum for what was supposed to be a discreet rendezvous. But here's where it gets juicier than a ripe watermelon on a hot day. James Reynolds, Maria's not-so-loving husband, was no fool. He saw dollar signs where others saw betrayal. Instead of confronting Hamilton in a gentlemanly duel, or, just leaving his wife, James decided to cash in on the situation. He blackmailed Hamilton, demanding hush money in exchange for keeping the affair under wraps. It was blackmail 101, and Hamilton, perhaps caught between his libido and his ledger, paid up. For a while, this sordid affair stayed under the radar, a scandal simmering quietly on the back burner. But secrets have a nasty habit of coming to light, especially when they involve powerful men and people with loose lips. Fast forward to 1797, when James Monroe and two other political figures, John Muhlenberg and Abraham Venable, caught wind of the affair while investigating James Reynolds for financial fraud. They confronted Hamilton, thinking they'd uncovered a corruption scandal. Hamilton, perhaps sensing the jig was up, came clean about the affair, insisting it was personal indiscretion, not political misconduct. In a move that would make any PR crisis team cringe, Hamilton decided honesty was the best policy. He published the Reynolds pamphlet, a 95-page document detailing the affair. Yes, you heard right. He confessed to adultery in print. This wasn't just any pamphlet. It was a public relations Hindenburg. Hamilton believed that by airing his dirty laundry himself, he could control the narrative. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite work out that way. The pamphlet, meant to clear his name of financial misconduct, instead spread the scandal further than butter on hot toast. Hamilton's reputation, carefully constructed through years of political maneuvering and intellectual prowess, took a nosedive. His enemies, including Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, were practically doing victory laps, relishing the downfall of a man they viewed as an elitist threat to their agrarian vision for America. Here's the ironic twist. Hamilton, the architect of the Federalist Papers, which advocated for a strong central government, was now the central figure in a drama that seemed ripped from the pages of a tabloid. The Reynolds affair didn't just tarnish his personal reputation. It provided ammunition to his political adversaries, painting him as morally compromised and untrustworthy. Yet, in the grand tapestry of history, the affair reveals more about the era's social and political fabric than just Hamilton's personal failings. It highlights the burgeoning American obsession with the private lives of public figures, something that would evolve into a national pastime by the time the 20th century rolled around. It also underscores the precarious balance between power and vulnerability, showing us that even the most towering figures have feet of clay. So, what do we make of Hamilton in the aftermath of the Reynolds scandal? Was he a flawed hero, victim of his own hubris and human desires? Or was he a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the great and powerful can fall prey to their baser instincts? Perhaps he was both, an enigmatic blend of brilliance and vulnerability, whose life was as complex as the nation he helped to shape. As we leave Hamilton grappling with the fallout of his indiscretions, remember this: The Reynolds affair was a chapter, not the book. It was a blip in the larger narrative of a man whose contributions to the American experiment were as enduring as they were controversial. And as we gear up for the next installment, let's keep one eye on the unfolding drama and another on the legacy of a founding father whose life was nothing short of operatic. Stay tuned, because the Hamilton saga is far from over, as we pivot from Hamilton's tabloid-worthy escapades to the eventual showdown that would etch his name in infamy. Let's set the stage for a duel that was less about honor and more about a powder keg of political tension. By the early 1800, Hamilton had become the human equivalent of a lightning rod, attracting controversy like moths to a flame. The guy just couldn't catch a break. His political enemies were legion, and his personal life was a mess. Enter Aaron Burr, vice president, political opportunist, and a man with a grudge sharper than a tailor's needle. Now, these two weren't exactly the odd couple, but their disdain for each other was palpable. Burr was Hamilton's ideological opposite, a man who seemed to embody everything Hamilton found repugnant in politics: ambition without principle and opportunism without restraint. Burr's political maneuvering was as subtle as a marching band in a library, and Hamilton, never one to hold back, called him out publicly. In fact, during the election of 1800, Hamilton's influence was instrumental in Thomas Jefferson winning the presidency, even though Hamilton didn't exactly have Jefferson's picture on his mantelpiece either. It was a classic case of choosing the lesser evil, and it left Burr out in the cold, fuming like a kettle about to boil over. Fast forward to 1804, and things between Hamilton and Burr had escalated from political sniping to full-blown animosity. Burr, now a political pariah, and facing the end of his vice-presidential term, decided to run for governor of New York. Hamilton, never one to shy away from a good political fight, reportedly worked behind the scenes to thwart Burr's ambitions. And when Burr lost the governorship, he blamed Hamilton, like a kid pointing fingers after a sandcastle is trampled. The final straw came when a letter surfaced, in which Hamilton allegedly described Burr as a dangerous man who shouldn't be trusted with the reins of government. Burr, sensing yet another opportunity to play the aggrieved party, demanded satisfaction in the form of a duel. It was an outdated custom, even then, more suited to the pages of a Gothic novel than the burgeoning democracy of America. But both men, slaves to their own egos, agreed to meet on the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey, because nothing screams settling differences like crossing state lines for a violent face-off. And so, on July 11, 1804, the fateful encounter unfolded at the crack of dawn. Hamilton, ever the strategist, reportedly decided to throw away his shot, a noble gesture that involved intentionally missing Burr. Whether this was a calculated move to uphold his honor without actually harming Burr, or simply a miscalculation, remains a topic of historical debate. Burr, however, had no such reservations. His shot found its mark, hitting Hamilton in the lower abdomen and fracturing his vertebrae. As Hamilton fell, so did his dreams of political redemption. He died the following day, leaving behind a nation that barely understood the magnitude of its loss. The duel was the culmination of a rivalry that had more layers than a milfoil pastry, but it also served as a stark reminder of the era's brutal realities. The romanticism of pistols at dawn fades quickly when faced with the harsh truth. Two men, both influential, reduced to settling their differences through violence in an age striving for civility and law. It was a relic of a bygone era, an absurd anachronism in a young republic that prided itself on reason and debate. Hamilton's death sent ripples through the political landscape. Burr's reputation, already teetering on the edge, plummeted into the abyss. He was indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey, though charges were eventually dropped. Burr's political career was effectively over, his legacy tarnished beyond repair. A man remembered more for what he destroyed than for what he achieved. As we sift through the aftermath, it's tempting to paint Hamilton as the tragic hero, a man cut down in his prime, a visionary whose dreams for America were left unfinished. But let's not sugarcoat it. Hamilton was complex, a man whose ambition often outpaced his discretion. His vision of a strong, centralized government, a robust financial system, and a nation capable of standing toe-to-toe with the European powers laid the groundwork for modern America. Yet, his methods and his brash demeanor made him as many enemies as allies. Hamilton's legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of brilliance and controversy. His economic policies laid the foundation for a nation that would grow into a global powerhouse. He was a man of contradictions, advocating for democracy while distrusting the masses, championing the rule of law while engaging in a duel that defied it. But perhaps that's what makes him so compelling, a founding father who was as fallible as he was formidable. In the end, Hamilton's life is a reminder that history is messy, filled with contradictions and complexities. It's easy to immortalize him as a tragic figure, a martyr for the cause of federalism, but the truth is far richer and more nuanced. He was a man of vision and vice, whose contributions to American society were as significant as his personal failings were glaring. His story is a cautionary tale wrapped in the romance of the American dream, a legacy that continues to resonate in the corridors of power and the hearts of those who dare to dream big. As the curtain falls on Hamilton's life, we remember him not just for his triumphs and tragedies, but for the indelible mark he left on the American experiment, a legacy that, like the man himself, defies easy categorization. In the bustling heart of the Mediterranean, a city rose that seemed to defy the odds, much like a meticulous sandcastle standing firm against the relentless waves. This was Carthage, and if you haven't heard of it, you might know its more famous rival, Rome. But before we get into that epic sibling rivalry, let's talk about how Carthage became the prodigious powerhouse it was. This wasn't a fluke or a stroke of luck. Carthage was smartly placed at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, setting the stage for it to become the GPS-less navigation guru of the ancient world. Now, if you were a Carthaginian sailor, you wouldn't have Siri to tell you to turn left in 100 meters. Instead, you'd rely on the stars, the sun, and some serious maritime instinct. The Carthaginians were masters of the sea, and their ships were the Teslas of antiquity, minus the autopilot. Their knack for navigation was legendary, allowing them to cruise the Mediterranean like it was their personal swimming pool. And why not? With a location like theirs, straddling the North African coast, Carthage was perfectly poised to dominate trade from Spain to the Levant. But let's not romanticize this maritime prowess too much. Sure, the Carthaginians were skilled sailors, but their success was also due to good old-fashioned economics. Carthage had a knack for turning geographical advantages into cold, hard cash. The city became an entrepot for everything from precious metals and textiles to exotic goods like ivory and spices. Their harbor was a sight to behold, a marvel of ancient engineering that could dock up to 220 ships. Picture an amphitheater of the sea, and you're halfway there. Speaking of harbors, Carthage's maritime architecture was nothing short of genius. The city boasted not one, but two harbors, ingeniously designed to separate commercial and military activities. The circular military harbor, or Carthon, was equipped with an island at its center, perfect for keeping a discreet eye on the comings and goings of the fleet. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a naval base with a touch of espionage chic. This setup allowed Carthage to maintain a fleet that could be launched at a moment's notice. Not bad for a civilization that didn't have the luxury of telegraph wires or WhatsApp notifications. Yet, even with these architectural and navigational triumphs, Carthage wasn't all smooth sailing. The city's rise involved a delicate balancing act of diplomacy, military might, and economic savvy. Carthage was a republic, much like Rome, but with its own unique twist. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families, who elected two suffetes, or judges, to govern. Imagine a corporate boardroom where the stakes are not quarterly profits, but the fate of an empire. These leaders had to juggle internal politics while keeping the peace with neighboring states. No small feat in a region where alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Through it all, Carthage thrived by creating a network of colonies and trade agreements that would make any modern multinational corporation green with envy. By 500 BCE, Carthage had established a sprawling trade network that included parts of Sicily, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. This wasn't just for show. These territories were vital to Carthage's economic health, providing resources like the silver from Spain's mines. which, fun fact, helped bankroll Carthage's endeavors, much to Rome's later chagrin. But before we get too caught up in the romance of Carthage's rise, let's remember the less glamorous parts. The city's prosperity was built on the backs of a complex social system that included a significant number of slaves. While the elite dined on exotic foods and traded fine goods, the lower classes toiled to keep the Carthaginian machine running. It's easy to get swept up in tales of ancient glory, but behind every monumental achievement was a grittier reality, often overlooked in the stories passed down through generations. So, what can we take away from this early chapter in Carthage's story? It's a tale of strategic brilliance, economic foresight, and yes, a fair amount of luck. But it's also a reminder of the complexities that underpin historical success stories. Carthage was a city that understood its strengths and played to them with aplomb, creating a legacy that would endure even as the tides of history turned. As we continue to explore the architectural wonders and the strategic genius of Carthage, remember that beneath the surface of its maritime mastery and economic dominance lay a city navigating the intricate web of ancient geopolitics, one savvy decision at a time. As we pivot from the maritime mastery of Carthage to its urban heart, let's dive headfirst into the grid-like marvels of its urban planning. Picture a city that was laid out with the precision of a Lego enthusiast, but on a grand scale. Forget the chaotic sprawl of other ancient cities. Carthage was the Sudoku puzzle of urban design, cleverly arranged to balance beauty and utility. The Carthaginians weren't just building a city, they were crafting an empire's nerve center. Central to this was their grid pattern, a hallmark of organized urban planning long before SimCity made it cool. The streets crisscrossed in a neat checkerboard fashion, each block meticulously measured to ensure that even the most directionally challenged could find their way from the bustling markets to the grand public squares without ending up in a minotaur's labyrinth. But this was more than just about aesthetics. The layout was a stroke of economic genius. It facilitated trade and movement, allowing goods to flow as freely as the Mediterranean breeze. Traders and merchants could easily navigate the city, a critical factor when your economy relies on the constant hum of commerce. This wasn't just urban planning, it was economic strategy made concrete. Now, let's talk water management. In a city that basked under the North African sun, water was more precious than gold. Carthage's engineers pulled no punches, crafting aqueducts and cisterns that could put modern water management to shame. They didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing, but they had something almost as good: ingenuity and a touch of ancient magic. Water was channeled from the hills, stored in vast underground cisterns, and distributed across the city with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. And here's where it gets interesting. Carthage boasted an impressively low incidence of waterborne diseases. How did they manage that? Well, the city was suspiciously ahead of its time in terms of sanitation. While other ancient cities were content with open sewers that flowed like the Tiber on a bad day, Carthage sewage systems were designed to whisk waste away from the urban areas, maintaining a level of cleanliness that would make even modern cities envious. Now, before we get too misty-eyed about this ancient utopia, let's puncture some myths. Sure, Carthage had its act together in many ways, but it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The city's impressive sanitation wasn't purely out of benevolence, it was a necessity. In a place where your neighbor could be a stone's throw away, disease could spread like gossip in a Roman forum. So, maintaining cleanliness was less about altruism and more about survival. Moreover, let's not ignore the darker side of Carthaginian life. Their society was starkly divided, with the elite living in opulent homes, complete with private baths, while the lower classes resided in more modest quarters. The urban planning that we admire today was also a tool of social stratification. The affluent lived in the city's center, close to the political and religious heart, while the less fortunate were relegated to the outskirts. These subtle, yet deliberate, divisions ensured that the social hierarchy was as rigid as a Carthaginian spear. And then there's the PR machine. Carthage's reputation as a pristine, orderly city was as much about image as reality. The slick scrolls of the time would have you believe it was a paradise on earth, but the truth was a bit more nuanced. The city's cleanliness and order were often maintained through strict regulations and occasionally a heavy hand. It was a place where the rule of law was as unyielding as the North African sun. So, what's the takeaway from Carthage's urban story? This was a city that didn't just happen by accident. Behind its gleaming facade was a complex web of planning, pragmatism, and power plays. Carthage was a place that understood the art of balance, blending beauty with practicality, all while maintaining its place in the annals of history. As we continue to explore this ancient powerhouse, let's keep our eyes peeled for the myths and realities that shaped its legacy, one meticulously planned street at a time. But of course, city's reputation isn't built on urban planning alone. Let's take a jaunt into the architectural wonders that made Carthage more than just a well-laid-out trading hub. Strap in, because we're diving into the grand, the sacred, and the downright opulent, the religious structures and public buildings that made this ancient metropolis a real life set for a historical blockbuster. Carthaginian temples were not just places of worship. They were statements of power, wealth, and a little bit of look what we can do bravado. Take the Temple of Eshmun, for example. Situated on Biasa Hill, it wasn't just a temple. It was a literal high point of Carthaginian architecture, towering over the city like a divine skyscraper. This temple, dedicated to the god of healing, was more than 30 meters tall, impressive even by today's standards, where we measure buildings by their ability to house overpriced coffee shops. Now, why build temples that could rival a modern-day blockbuster set? The answer lies in a cocktail of politics, religion, and a dash of ego. Carthage was a city that understood the power of spectacle. Not unlike a modern political campaign, these grandiose structures broadcast messages of strength and stability to both locals and visiting dignitaries. In a time when guards were as real as the guy next door, temples served as insurance policies for the city's well-being. They were the ancient equivalent of a 5-star Yelp review, reinforcing Carthage's status as a city favored by the divine. Let's not forget the economic considerations. These temples weren't just spiritual hubs, they were economic centers as well. Pilgrims flocked to them, bringing offerings that lined the pockets of the priestly class, and by extension, the city's coffers. And while we're myth-busting, let's debunk the idea of a purely pious populace. Sure, people wanted to stay on the God's good side, but they were also motivated by good old-fashioned economics. When it came to temples, the Carthaginians understood that faith and finance went hand in hand. But what about public buildings, you ask? Enter the Agora, Carthage's answer to the modern-day mall, complete with a food court of sorts. This was the heartbeat of civic life, a bustling hub of commerce, politics, and socializing. If you think your local city hall is impressive, imagine a place where decisions affecting the entire Mediterranean world were made over the clamor of merchants hawking their wares. The Agora was the real deal, a testament to Carthage's prowess in blending utility with grandeur. And let's not gloss over the fact that these structures were more than just meeting places. They were designed to impress, with columns that stretched skyward and facades that would have made even the most seasoned Roman architect pause. This was no accident. In an age where visual impact could convey power more effectively than 1,000 treaties, architecture was a weapon in Carthage's diplomatic arsenal. Political significance aside, these public buildings also catered to the Carthaginian love for sport and entertainment. The city's amphitheater, for instance, had the capacity to hold upwards of 40,000 spectators, making it a veritable magnet for both the elite and the common folk. It was here that Carthage's social fabric was woven, with games and performances providing a welcome respite from the rigors of daily life. Think of it as the ancient world's antidote to the Monday blues, where gladiatorial contests and theatrical performances offered a heady mix of culture and carnage. All this, however, was underpinned by a relentless pragmatism. When Carthage built, it did so with an eye on both form and function. These structures weren't just there to look pretty. They were integral parts of a city that functioned like a well-oiled machine where every stone and column served a purpose. Yet, let's not romanticize too much. Behind the grandeur was a society as stratified as any. The temples and public buildings were monuments to power, but they were also reminders of the social hierarchies that defined Carthaginian life. And here's a little myth-busting nugget. Not every citizen got to enjoy these architectural wonders. Access to certain parts of the city was often determined by your social standing. If you were among the elite, you had front-row seats to the spectacle. If not, well, you got the nosebleed section, if you were lucky. This was a city that knew how to dazzle, but it also knew how to maintain its social order. So, as we marvel at the architectural achievements of Carthage, let's remember that these were not just feats of engineering, but also instruments of power and persuasion. They were the Instagram posts of their day, carefully curated, visually stunning, and full of hidden agendas. As we continue to explore the legacy of Carthage, let's keep our eyes open for the stories hidden in its stones, the whispers of history that remind us that behind every grand facade lies a tale of ambition, belief, and the human desire to leave a mark on the world. So, as we stand in awe of Carthage's architectural audacity, let's not forget how this flair spread like wildfire across its empire. Think of Carthaginian architecture as the Starbucks of the ancient world, ubiquitous, instantly recognizable, and sometimes met with a resigned eye roll. From North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, their designs were the blueprint for cities striving to capture a piece of that Carthaginian swagger. Take the city of Gadea, modern-day Cadiz, which was essentially a Carthaginian franchise with the same grid-like precision found in Carthage itself. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was urban planning with an agenda. Gadea, strategically situated on Spain's coastline, was a critical node in Carthage's trade network. Its layout wasn't just to impress the neighbors. It ensured that the flow of silver, Spain's most lucrative export, could be streamlined directly into Carthage's coffers. This was architectural imperialism at its finest, where form and function served the greater Carthaginian economy. Now, speaking of silver, let's talk about the economic engine that drove Carthage's expansion. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage wasn't just dabbling in overseas ventures. It was all in, like a high-stakes poker player with a penchant for empire building. But maintaining such an expansive empire wasn't cheap. Think of it as running a multinational corporation where the currency is silver, and the board members are ancient power brokers with a knack for seafaring. Carthage had an insatiable appetite for Iberian silver, a resource that funded everything from military campaigns to those grandiose temples. It's no exaggeration to say that silver was the lifeblood of their economy. In one particularly telling account, the mines in Spain were said to produce so much silver that the Carthaginians could afford to pay their mercenaries entirely in the shiny metal. And let's be clear, this wasn't just pocket change. This was serious silver, with scholars estimating that Carthage extracted upwards of 30 tons a year at the height of their mining operations. That's a lot of bling, even by ancient standards. But here's the kicker. While silver was the carrot, Carthage didn't shy away from wielding a rather large stick to keep its empire in line. Their colonial strategy, often sugar-coated in tales of benevolence, was more about control than kindness. To the Carthaginians, diplomacy often came with an asterisk: agree to our terms, or face the naval equivalent of a strongly worded letter. In Sardinia, for instance, Carthage's so-called benevolent colonial efforts were actually a series of strategic maneuvers to secure the island's resources and strategic ports. The locals, caught in the crossfire of Carthaginian expansion, found themselves part of an economic system that favored Carthage first, second, and third. It was less about building a community and more about reinforcing a supply chain, with Carthage at the top of the food chain. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Despite the firm grip Carthage had on its colonies, it often sold itself as a liberator, freeing territories from the dreaded influence of other powers, namely Rome. Yet this was less about altruism and more about strategic dominance. The reality was that Carthage's colonies were expected to pay tribute, a practice that was as old as empire itself. These tributes weren't just symbolic gestures. They were cold, hard cash, or rather, silver, filling the city's treasury. Let's not gloss over the cost of this expansion. While the silver flowed into Carthage, the expenses of running an empire were astronomical. Maintaining a powerful navy to patrol and protect trade routes was no small feat, and neither was keeping restless colonies in check. The Carthaginians had to be crafty, utilizing a mix of diplomacy, commerce, and when necessary, military might to keep their empire from fracturing. Yet, despite these efforts, the empire's expansion was a double-edged sword. While it brought wealth and power, it also stretched resources thin and sowed the seeds of dissent. The constant need for silver meant that Carthage's economy was like a cyclist on a high-speed tour. needing to keep moving to avoid toppling over. This relentless pursuit of wealth and expansion laid the groundwork for future conflicts, notably with Rome, who was not particularly fond of sharing the Mediterranean spotlight. As we unravel the tapestry of Carthage architectural and economic influence, it becomes clear that behind the grandeur was a complex web of strategy and ambition. Carthage wasn't just a city of stone and silver. It was a living, breathing entity driven by the same desires and frailties that define human history. It was a place where commerce met conquest, where the divine rubbed shoulders with the pragmatic, and where every brick laid was a testament to an empire's reach and its eventual overreach. So, as we ponder the legacy of Carthaginian architecture and its influence on the Mediterranean, let's remember that these designs were more than just aesthetic triumphs. They were strategic chess moves in a game where the stakes were as high as the hills of Biasa. As we continue to explore the rise and fall of Carthage, let's keep our eyes peeled for the stories etched into its foundations, tales of ambition, innovation, and the timeless quest for legacy. As we continue our journey through the architectural grandeur and strategic brilliance that was Carthage, it's time to face the music, or rather, the crashing cymbals of its dramatic fall. You see, for all its innovative spirit and architectural flair, Carthage was a bit like a Jenga tower, impressive to look at, but with one wrong move, it all came tumbling down. And when it fell, it was with a thunderous crash that echoed through time. The very innovations that propelled Carthage to greatness also sowed the seeds of its destruction, proving that the line between genius and folly is as thin as a North African breeze. Let's rewind to 146 BCE, the year when Rome decided to play demolition expert with Carthage's meticulously built empire. The Third Punic War was not just a battle for dominance, but a clash of titans, with Rome finally getting the upper hand. The Romans weren't exactly known for their subtlety, and when they finally breached Carthage's defenses, they razed the city to the ground with the kind of ruthlessness that would make even a Game of Thrones villain blush. It was a scorched earth policy, quite literally, as they salted the ground to ensure nothing would grow again. Though modern historians argue this might be more myth than fact, still, it's a powerful image, one that stuck in the collective imagination like a particularly vivid nightmare. But why did Carthage fall? Well, it's a classic tale of overreach and hubris. Carthage's relentless expansion and dependence on trade and tribute made it vulnerable. The very network of colonies and trade routes that once filled its coffers became a logistical nightmare to maintain. Imagine trying to run a sprawling empire with a communication lag that would put dial-up internet to shame. Decisions took time, and time was a luxury Carthage could ill afford against the relentless efficiency of Rome's military machine. Moreover, Carthage's internal political structure, which once seemed like a well-oiled machine, began to show cracks. The Suffites and ruling families were more interested in preserving their own power than adapting to the changing geopolitical landscape. It's the kind of political gridlock that feels all too familiar today. Meanwhile, Rome, with its centralized power and relentless military innovation, was like an unstoppable force meeting a slightly movable object. The irony is palpable. The same architectural and economic prowess that built Carthage's empire also made it a target too tempting for Rome to ignore. Those grid-like streets, designed for optimal trade and movement, became pathways for Roman soldiers. The harbors, which once teemed with Carthaginian ships, were now eerily silent, save for the sound of Roman galleys. The mighty walls that symbolized Carthage's strength crumbled under the weight of its own ambition and Rome's relentless siege. Yet, even in its destruction, Carthage left behind a legacy that would influence architecture and urban planning for centuries. Rome, ever the pragmatist, absorbed many of Carthage's innovations. The Romans were like the original recyclers, taking what worked and making it their own. They may have destroyed Carthage, but they couldn't erase its influence. The Carthaginian knack for urban planning, water management, and monumental architecture left an indelible mark on Roman cities, and by extension, on the Western world. The myths surrounding Carthage add another layer to its legacy. The story of its rise and fall is a potent narrative, a cautionary tale of ambition and hubris that has resonated through the ages. There's something inherently human in the story of Carthage, a reminder that greatness is often accompanied by risk, and that the line between success and failure is as thin as a Carthaginian coin. It's no wonder the tale of Carthage has been romanticized and mythologized, turning its history into a narrative as compelling as any epic. For modern architects and urban planners, Carthage offers lessons in both innovation and caution. The Carthaginians were masters of leveraging their environment, using architecture not just as a means of construction, but as a tool of economic and political strategy. Yet, their story also serves as a reminder of the dangers of overextension and the importance of adaptability. In a world where environmental and economic challenges are ever present, the rise and fall of Carthage offer a blueprint of what to do and what not to do. So, as we close the book on Carthage, let's remember it not just as a city that fell, but as a civilization that dared to reach for the stars. Its legacy is etched in the stones of ancient ruins, in the myths that continue to capture our imagination, and in the lessons that still resonate today. Carthage was more than just a city of stone and silver. It was a testament to human ingenuity and the eternal quest to leave a mark on the world. And in that, it succeeded, leaving behind a story as enduring as the sands of the North African coast. In the spring of 1837, a diminutive 18-year-old named Alexandria Victoria awoke one morning to find herself the Queen of England. Now, if you're imagining a grand, fairy tale-esque coronation ceremony with trumpets blaring and subjects cheering, hold your horses. The reality was a little different, more akin to being thrust onto a roller coaster without a safety bar. Victoria, all 5 feet of her, found out she was going to be the sovereign ruler of the British Empire while still in her pajamas. Talk about waking up on the right side of history. But let's backtrack a second. Victoria was never supposed to be queen. In fact, she was a plan C, maybe even D, in the Hanoverian family tree, which was as convoluted as a soap opera plot. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, was the 4th son of King George Roman III. Edward's older brothers either failed to produce legitimate offspring or had the audacity to die prematurely. By 1819, the crown was up for grabs like the last slice of pizza, and it landed squarely on young Victoria's head. Her father, unfortunately, kicked the bucket when she was just 8 months old, leaving her to be raised by her uber-controlling German mom, the Duchess of Kent, and her mom's scheming advisor, Sir John Conroy. Now, the Duchess wasn't exactly Mother of the Year material. Her parenting style was a bizarre mix of helicopter and prison warden. Victoria couldn't even sleep in her own bedroom without her mother by her side. Imagine a teenage girl trying to figure out her place in the world while her mom was always peering over her shoulder. Awkward dinners, indeed. The young princess was kept in a bubble, isolated from the court, and with a social circle as wide as a ruler. The Kensington system, they called it, a regimen strict enough to make a military academy look like summer camp. When King William Roman IV finally shuffled off this mortal coil in June 1837, Victoria was more than ready to leave the nest, or at least step out from her mother's shadow. Enter Lord Melbourne, the charming and politically savvy Prime Minister, who quickly became Victoria's closest confidant and guide. Melbourne was a man of experience, having served as Prime Minister before, and he was just what the young Queen needed, a political Yoda with a penchant for conversation and a knack for navigating the treacherous waters of British politics. Victoria, for her part, was eager to learn. Her early years as Queen were a crash course in ruling an empire, and like any teenager suddenly thrust into the spotlight, she had her fair share of missteps. One particularly amusing episode, she attempted to banish her mother to a distant wing of the palace, only to find out that the logistics of royal housing were more complex than her youthful defiance anticipated. The Brits, after all, have a long tradition of pomp, circumstance, and architecture that defies practical use. But it wasn't all teenage rebellion and political faux pas. Victoria's relationship with Melbourne, often depicted as a grand mentor-student dynamic, was crucial in shaping her early reign. Melbourne, with his easy charm and worldly wisdom, taught her the ins and outs of constitutional monarchy, and Victoria absorbed it all like a sponge. She learned to play the political game, balancing the power of her role with the realities of a parliament that wasn't about to let a teenager wield unchecked power. It was like a masterclass in leadership, delivered over endless cups of tea. And then there were the balls, the banquets, the endless parade of societal expectations that came with being a young queen in the Victorian era. Imagine being the most eligible bachelorette in the world, with every eligible bachelor, and his mother, jockeying for a dance with you. A lesser person would have been overwhelmed, but Victoria took it all in stride, even if she did occasionally retreat to her beloved journal to vent. "I never spent a quieter or more dull evening," she once wrote, channeling the universal teenage angst of being forced to socialize when all she wanted was a quiet night in with a good book. Yet, as much as her reign was about adjusting to newfound power, it was also about challenging the status quo. Victoria was determined to break free from the controlling grip of her mother and Conroy, and Melbourne was instrumental in helping her establish her independence. Within a few years, she had not only solidified her position as queen, but had also set the stage for a new era in British history. The Victorian era, as it would come to be known, was marked by industrial innovation, cultural shifts, and an empire that stretched across the globe. But in these early years, it was still just a young Victoria, learning the ropes, making mistakes, and occasionally rolling her eyes at the absurdities of royal life. So, while her ascent to the throne might not have been the romantic fairy tale of popular imagination, it was a testament to Victoria's resilience and adaptability. She was a ruler who learned on the job, who turned to trusted advisors like Melbourne for guidance, and who, despite the odds, managed to steer the British monarchy into the modern age. As the 19th century marched on, Victoria would grow into one of the most iconic figures in history, but these formative years were as much about growing up as they were about growing into her role. And that, folks, is the origin story of a queen who started her reign as an inexperienced teenager and went on to rule an empire with a firm yet compassionate hand. So, as Victoria settled into her role, the British Empire was already starting to flex its muscles like a bodybuilder in a tight turtleneck. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the empire was expanding faster than a waistline after a month-long holiday binge. Factories were springing up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, churning out textiles, iron, and other goods at a pace that would make even the most ambitious of modern startups envious. By the mid-19th century, Britain was producing over 70% of the world's iron and coal. The engine of industrialization was pumping raw power into the empire's veins, fueling its imperial ambitions. And what better way to showcase this newfound might than with a grand spectacle? Enter the Great Exhibition of 1851. Picture it, the Crystal Palace, a marvel of glass and steel erected in Hyde Park, standing as a testament to human ingenuity and Victorian flair for the dramatic. Prince Albert, Victoria's beloved husband, had a significant hand in organizing this monumental event. He envisioned it as a great festival of peace, a chance to flaunt British innovation and industrial prowess to the world. Over 6 million people flocked to the exhibition, which essentially turned into the world's first World's Fair. It was like the Coachella of its day, minus the flower crowns and Instagram influencers. Visitors were treated to an array of exhibits that might seem quaint today, but were the peak of technological advancement back then. Exhibit A, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a rock so big and shiny it could blind you if you stared at it too long. It was a glittering symbol of the empire's reach, having been acquired from India, albeit controversially. Then there were steam engines, telegraphs, and other mechanical wonders that were the Victorian equivalent of the latest iPhone. For a society that loved both progress and pomp, the Great Exhibition was a dazzling success. Now, Victoria herself was no technophobe. In fact, she was fascinated by the new gadgets and gizmos that were popping up like dandelions. Imagine her delight when she first encountered the telegraph, a device that could send messages across vast distances in mere minutes. It was like texting, but with a lot more darts and dashes. In 1844, when the first telegraph line was laid between Paddington and Slough, Victoria was reportedly thrilled to send and receive telegrams, despite the fact that her first message was simply a mundane exchange about a royal train schedule. Not exactly scintillating conversation, but hey, it was the 19th century. This fascination with technology wasn't just a hobby. It had serious economic implications. The telegraph, alongside the burgeoning railway network, revolutionized communication and transportation, knitting the far-flung corners of the empire closer together. Goods could be transported more efficiently, markets expanded, and the empire's coffers swelled. By 1850, there were over 6,000 miles of railway track crisscrossing Britain, and this iron web continued to spread. It was the dawn of globalization, Victorian style, with Britain at its epicenter. Of course, with great power comes great complexity. While the industrial and imperial expansions brought wealth and progress, they also intensified existing social divides. The factories and mines that fueled Britain's prosperity were often hellish places, with laborers working long hours in dangerous conditions for meager pay. Child labor was rampant, with pint-sized workers as young as 5 toiling away in conditions that would make a sweatshop look like a summer job. It was a world of stark contrasts, gilded salons and grimy back alleys, prosperity built on the backs of the working class. The myth of the benevolent empire, spreading civilization and progress, was a comforting narrative for those at the top. But the reality was more complicated, with economic exploitation and cultural imposition often going hand in hand with technological advancement. The sun never set on the British Empire, as the saying went, but for many it was a harsh and unyielding light. Victoria, in her way, was both a product and a driver of this era. While she may not have been directly involved in the machinations of empire building, her reign symbolized Britain's dominance and the complexity that came with it. She was a queen who embraced the trappings of modernity, yet her rule was also marked by traditionalism and the maintenance of a rigid social order. The Victorian era was a time of contradictions, a period where progress and exploitation were two sides of the same imperial coin. So, as we delve deeper into the era of Victoria, it's essential to remember that history is rarely as simple or as romantic as it appears in the books. The Victorian age was a time of great innovation and even greater disparity, a reality that shaped the world in ways both profound and problematic. As the empire expanded, so too did the complexities of its rule, setting the stage for the next act in this grand historical drama. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more intrigue and innovation to unravel. Now, if you thought Victoria's reign was all about industry and empire, you're missing the juicy bit, her personal life. Enter Prince Albert, stage left. Their love story, often painted with the pastel hues of a Hallmark special, was more complex than a Rubik's Cube. They were cousins, first cousins to be precise, because nothing says royalty quite like keeping it in the family. Despite the eyebrow-raising genealogy, their union was a pivotal moment for the British monarchy. Victoria first met Albert in 1836, and let's just say it wasn't love at first sight. But by their second meeting in 1839, Cupid had clearly upped his game. Victoria proposed to Albert, a role reversal that would make even the most progressive modern couple nod in approval. They married on February 10, 1840, a date that would go down in history as the beginning of a partnership that was as much about personal affection as it was about strategic alliance. Albert wasn't your average royal accessory. He was a man of intellect and ambition. Together, they were like the dynamic duo of the 19th century, attending to the arts, sciences, and social reforms with a vigor that would put today's power couples to shame. He wasn't just the handsome prince. He was more like the human version of a Swiss Army knife, versatile, efficient, and indispensable. Albert's interest in arts and sciences wasn't just a hobby. It was a full-blown passion. He was a driving force behind the establishment of institutions like the Royal Albert Hall and the Victoria and Albert Museum. He believed in the power of knowledge and culture to elevate society, a notion that was both forward-thinking and slightly intimidating. If you ever feel guilty for Netflix binging instead of reading a book, just imagine living with Albert. Speaking of societal elevation, Albert also took a hard look at the nation's moral compass. He was instrumental in the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. Talk about a mic-drop moment in history. His impact reverberated far beyond the palace walls, influencing legislation and public attitudes. His death in 1861, at just 42 years old, was not just a personal tragedy for Victoria, it was a seismic event for the nation. Victoria's mourning was monumental, lasting for a decade. She dressed in black, like the original Garth. It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a public declaration of her enduring grief. Her withdrawal from public life was so pronounced that it sparked rumors and speculation. Was she hiding away in her ivory tower of sorrow? The public, accustomed to her visible presence, was left to wonder. In her absence, the press wasn't kind, dubbing her the Widow of Windsor. They speculated on everything from her sanity to her capability to rule. Imagine being the subject of public gossip on a scale that makes Twitter trolls look like amateurs. Her retreat added fuel to the fire of a restless public, who were beginning to question the relevance of the monarchy itself. Albert's influence on Victoria's reign was profound. He had been her confidant, advisor, and partner in every sense. Without him, she was adrift in a sea of political and personal challenges. The empire was booming, yes, but it was also a time of social upheaval. The working class was growing restless, and the political landscape was shifting like sand dunes in a storm. Victoria, once a symbol of youthful vigor and progress, was now seen as a relic of a bygone era. But let's not romanticize their relationship beyond recognition. While their marriage was indeed a loving partnership, it was also one of Victorian expectations and roles. Albert was the guiding hand, and Victoria often deferred to his judgment, a dynamic that seems both quaint and unsettling by today's standards. Yet it worked for them, and together they shaped an era. Their shared passion for the arts and sciences left an indelible mark on British culture. They championed initiatives that would lay the groundwork for a society that valued education and innovation, even if the benefits weren't immediately apparent to all. In a way, they were the ultimate Victorian influencers, shaping tastes and trends from the confines of Buckingham Palace. Albert's death marked a turning point, both for Victoria personally and for the monarchy. The Queen, who had once been a symbol of Britain's burgeoning empire, was now a figure of mystery and melancholy. Her retreat from the public eye was as much about personal grief as it was about navigating the treacherous waters of public perception. In an era when the monarchy's relevance was increasingly questioned, Victoria's seclusion seemed like a relic of a past age. Yet she endured. The woman who had started her reign in her pajamas went on to become the longest-reigning British monarch, until Elizabeth Roman II came along, and that wasn't by accident. Her resilience, even in the face of personal tragedy, was a testament to her strength and determination. She may have been a queen in mourning, but she was also a queen who understood the power of legacy. As we continue our journey through Victoria's life, remember that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry of contradictions, where love and duty intertwine in ways that are both beautiful and tragic. So, stay tuned, because the Victorian saga is far from over, and there's plenty more to untangle in this grand historical drama. As Victoria's reign marched on, it became a study in contrasts between the values she supposedly championed and the reality of the era she presided over. The term Victorian values gets tossed around like a hot potato at a family reunion, often evoking images of stiff upper lips, moral rectitude, and an obsession with propriety. Let's not kid ourselves. These so-called values were upheld with the same consistency as a toddler promising to eat their vegetables. While the surface glittered with decorum, underneath was a seething cauldron of hypocrisy and contradiction. Take, for example, the Victorian obsession with virtue and family values. The image of Victoria as the doting mother of 9 children, the grandmother of Europe, was as carefully curated as a modern influencer's Instagram feed. Yet, the reality of family life, for most Victorians, was a far cry from the royal nursery. Child labour laws were more of a suggestion than a rule, with little ones scurrying up chimneys and into factory floors as early as age 5. Meanwhile, the upper classes extolled the virtues of domestic bliss, conveniently ignoring the legions of nannies and governesses who actually raised their children. Politically, Victoria's later years were a roller coaster of changing tides. Her relationship with the expanding role of democracy was, shall we say, complicated. Picture an old-school monarch trying to navigate the Spotify playlist of a modern democracy without accidentally deleting the whole thing. As the 19th century progressed, the British political landscape was evolving faster than a caterpillar on a caffeine binge. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 expanded the electoral franchise, bringing the voice of the common man, Reed, more male voters into Parliament. This wasn't exactly Victoria's cup of tea. She had a distinct preference for the aristocratic status quo, where power was as exclusive as a VIP lounge at a nightclub. Enter Benjamin Disraeli, stage right, a man as cunning as a fox in a henhouse. Disraeli, the dashing Tory Prime Minister, was the political equivalent of a smooth-talking salesman who could sell sand in the desert. He and Victoria struck up the most unlikely of alliances, an odd couple dynamic that would have made for a hit reality TV show. With his flair for drama and rhetorical flourish, Disraeli managed to charm the Queen, referring to her as the Fairy, a nickname that must have tickled Victoria after years of being portrayed as the stern matriarch. Disraeli's charm offensive wasn't just about sweet talk, it was strategic. He knew the value of having the monarch in his corner, especially when pushing his imperial agenda. In 1876, he even had Victoria crowned Empress of India, a title that was more about political theatre than practical power. The move was designed to bolster British authority in the subcontinent, but it also played into the myth of Victoria as the benevolent ruler of a vast empire. Never mind that her influence in Indian affairs was about as hands-on as a holographic handshake. Yet, even as Disraeli and Victoria played their game of political chess, the harsh realities of empire were impossible to ignore. The British Raj was a land of stark contrasts, where opulent palaces coexisted with grinding poverty, and the myth of the civilizing mission was a convenient cover for economic exploitation. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 had already exposed the fragility of British rule, and subsequent policies often prioritized profit over people. It was a reminder that the empire's grandeur was built on a foundation as shaky as a house of cards. Back home, the shifting political winds were a constant challenge for Victoria. The rise of the Liberal Party, with its focus on social reforms and expanding the franchise, was like an itch she couldn't scratch. Figures like William Gladstone, Disraeli's political rival, championed causes that often left Victoria cold. Gladstone's moralizing ways and penchant for public lectures were a stark contrast to Disraeli's suave diplomacy, and their rivalry was the stuff of political legend. Victoria once famously remarked that Gladstone addressed her as if he were speaking to a public meeting rather than a queen. It's the 19th century equivalent of being mansplained at a family dinner. Despite her personal preferences, Victoria couldn't ignore the changing tides. The late 19th century was a time of social upheaval, with the labor movement gaining traction and calls for women's suffrage growing louder. The latter was enough to give Victoria the royal heebie-jeebies. She famously referred to women's rights as a mad, wicked folly, a sentiment as subtle as a sledgehammer in a china shop. In her mind, the idea of women stepping into the political arena was as appealing as hosting a tea party for anarchists. Yet, for all her resistance, Victoria's reign was paradoxically a catalyst for change. Her very presence as a female monarch in a male-dominated world was a silent testament to shifting gender dynamics, even if she wasn't the champion of women's rights. Her long reign provided a semblance of stability amid the swirling political currents, a constant in a world that was anything but. As the 19th century drew to a close, the British Empire was at its zenith, a global behemoth with a reach as vast as it was complex. Victoria, now in her twilight years, was more a symbol than an active player, a living relic of an age that was rapidly slipping into history. Her image as the grandmother of Europe was more than just familial. It spoke to a network of alliances and power dynamics that spanned the continent. Her descendants sat on thrones across Europe, a tangled web of connections that would both unite and divide the continent in the years to come. But let's not put a crown on the narrative just yet. The Victorian saga was far from over, and the closing act was rife with intrigue, innovation, and more than a few surprises. As we look ahead to the final chapters of Victoria's reign, it's clear that the legacy she left behind was as complex and contradictory as the age she defined. So stay tuned, because the story of Victoria is a tapestry woven with threads of power, politics, and personal drama, and there's plenty more to unravel before the curtain falls. As Victoria approached the twilight of her reign, she was less a monarch in command and more a living symbol, a kind of national grandmother knitting her way through history. Her image was plastered across the empire like a 19th century rock star, reminding everyone of Britain's supposed grandeur. But behind the sepia-toned portraits and quaint narratives of the Victorian age lurked a reality as complex as a soap opera with 100 subplots. The romanticized notion of a golden era often glosses over the gritty details that made it anything but idyllic. First, let's tackle the myth of the Victorian age as a time of unblemished progress and prosperity. Sure, the Industrial Revolution was a game-changer, transforming Britain into the world's workshop with stats to prove it. By 1900, the UK was responsible for about 25% of global industrial production. That's like having a quarter of the world's Spotify streams, but for coal and textiles. Yet, it wasn't all steam engines and shiny new gadgets. For every glittering crystal palace, there were 1,000 grimy factories where workers toiled in conditions that would make a Dickensian novel look like a bedtime story. Victoria's empire was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was the largest empire the world had ever seen, with territory on every continent except Antarctica, though give them time, and they probably would have tried to colonize the penguins. On the other hand, this massive expanse was a logistical nightmare, governed by a system that often prioritized profit over people. The empire was like a sprawling corporation with too many branches, where the board of directors cared more about the bottom line than employee welfare. Economically, Britain was booming, but socially, the inequalities were as glaring as an overexposed photograph. While the upper crust enjoyed afternoon teas and cricket on the lawn, the working class was barely scraping by. Housing was a mess, with families crammed into tenements that would make a sardine tin look spacious. In 1889, Charles Booth's survey revealed that 30% of London's population lived in poverty. For a nation that prided itself on civility and class, that's a statistic that sticks in the craw like a burnt crumpet. Politically, the era was one of gradual yet significant change. Victoria herself was often a reluctant passenger on the train of progress, clinging to her aristocratic ideals as the world whizzed by outside the window. The expansion of the franchise through successive reform acts was like letting more people into the exclusive club of decision-making, albeit begrudgingly. By 1884, about two-thirds of adult men had the vote, but women were still waiting on the sidelines, a fact that would ignite the suffrage movement like dry tinder. Then there was the small matter of Britain's role on the global stage. The empire was a powerhouse, but it was also a powder keg. The colonies were rife with tension and rebellion, and the so-called civilizing mission was more about economic gain than moral uplift. The legacy of colonialism is a tangled web of exploitation and cultural imposition, a fact that history books sometimes skip over faster than a skipping stone across a pond. As the 20th century loomed, Victoria's health was declining like a faded photograph left too long in the sun. By the late 1890, she was a shadow of her former self, more figurehead than formidable ruler. Her death on January 22, 1901, marked the end of an era, a seismic shift as the Victorian age gave way to the uncertainties of the modern world. She passed away at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by family, leaving behind a legacy as sprawling and complex as the empire she had come to symbolize. Victoria's reign, which lasted 63 years, was the longest of any British monarch until Elizabeth Roman II surpassed her in 2015. Her life was a tapestry of contradictions, a blend of personal resilience and public rigidity. Her legacy is a reminder that history is rarely as simple as it seems, a patchwork of progress and pain stitched together with the threads of human ambition. The Victorian age, for all its glory and grit, set the stage for the 20th century and beyond, leaving a world both enriched and entangled by its legacy. Victoria's image, as the grandmother of Europe, was not just familial but political, a web of connections that would both bind and divide the continent in the years to come. Her descendants, sprinkled across the thrones of Europe, would find themselves embroiled in conflicts that were the direct descendants of the age she defined. The world she left behind was poised on the brink of unprecedented change, a realm where the old order was giving way to the tumultuous currents of modernity. In the end, Victoria's legacy is a mosaic of contradictions, a reminder that the past is never as quaint or as simple as it appears from a distance. Her reign was a testament to the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of myth in shaping our understanding of history. As we close the chapter on the Victorian Age, we're left with a story that is as much about the world we inherited as it is about the woman who helped shape it. And so, as the sun sets on this grand historical drama, we can appreciate the intricate tapestry of a legacy that continues to resonate, for better or for worse, in the world we know today. In the bustling heart of late 4th century Alexandria, where the Mediterranean sun blazed with the intensity of 1,000 questions left unanswered, a young Hypatia was about to embark on a journey that would make her name echo through the corridors of history. Picture a place where marble columns held up not just buildings, but the weight of a city teetering between the ancient and the new. Alexandria was the intellectual Las Vegas of its time, a glitzy hub of knowledge, where the currency wasn't just gold but ideas. And in this city, being a female scholar was about as common as finding a unicorn with a library card. Hypatia was born around 360 AD, a time when the Roman Empire was still holding its toga parties, but with a distinctly Egyptian twist. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a mathematician and philosopher, and let's be honest, a bit of a nerd by ancient standards. Theon wasn't just any old dad teaching his kid to ride a chariot. He was more like the geeky parent who insists on solving calculus problems during dinner. This guy was the last director of the famed Library of Alexandria, which, by the way, was not just a library, but more of an intellectual amusement park for the brainy elite. Theon wrote commentaries on works by Euclid and Ptolemy, guys who were the rock stars of the math and astronomy world back then. Education in Hypatia's era wasn't exactly a walk in the park, unless that park was filled with scrolls instead of squirrels. Forget about textbooks. We're talking about papyrus scrolls that were as unwieldy as they were flammable. And while today's digital natives complain about battery life, Hypatia had to deal with the literal fragility of her learning materials. One wrong move, and your entire semester's worth of notes could go up in smoke faster than you can say academic disaster. Theon's tutoring methods were, let's say, unconventional. Forget about Socratic seminars or modern pedagogical techniques. It was more like, here's a scroll, don't drop it in the Nile. And by the way, solve this impossible theorem before lunch. If these methods were transported to today's classrooms, parents would be storming the principal's office, demanding more play-based learning. But for Hypatia, this rigorous environment was the norm, and she thrived in it. Now, here's a fun tidbit. While other kids were probably playing with wooden dolls or whatever ancient Egyptian kids did for fun, Hypatia was being prepped to handle the Pythagorean theorem like it was child's play. Her education encompassed not just mathematics, but also astronomy, philosophy, and mechanics, fields that were, at the time, considered the exclusive domain of bearded men in togas. But Hypatia was nothing if not a trailblazer, and she lapped it all up with the enthusiasm of a scholar who saw no limits to her intellectual pursuits. There's a myth, romantic as it might be, that Hypatia's life was one long, uninterrupted arc of academic brilliance. But let's inject a little reality into the picture. Being a woman in academia during this era was like trying to win a chariot race with a flat tire. Sure, Hypatia had the advantage of her father's standing, but societal norms were as rigid as a Roman legionnaire's cuirass. Women were expected to be seen, not heard, and certainly not to be seen holding a stylus and wax tablet, jotting down notes on the motion of heavenly bodies. Yet, despite these odds, Hypatia became a symbol of learning and wisdom in a time when such attributes were ascribed mostly to men. And while she was busy calculating the mysteries of the universe, the social and political machinations of Alexandria were swirling around her like a sandstorm. The city was a melting pot of cultures and religions, and tensions simmered just beneath its scholarly surface. As a woman of reason in an increasingly irrational world, Hypatia's presence was both a beacon and a challenge to the status quo. In this environment, Hypatia didn't just survive, she thrived. She became a respected teacher and philosopher, attracting students from all over the Mediterranean. Her home was a makeshift classroom, where she lectured on mathematics and philosophy, often in the open air, because classrooms as we know them didn't quite exist yet. Her reputation as a scholar spread like wildfire, only the good kind, and she became an advisor to some of Alexandria's most powerful figures. But let's not pretend her path was all smooth sailing. Hypatia's life was a testament to the power of knowledge and the perils of standing out in a world that prized conformity. Her story is a reminder that intellectual curiosity can be both a gift and a peril, especially when navigating a landscape as complex and treacherous as 4th century Alexandria. So, as we delve deeper into the life of Hypatia, remember that her legacy is not just one of academic achievement, but also of courage and resilience in the face of societal norms that would have preferred her to stay silent. Her early life and education set the stage for a career that would inspire generations to question, to learn, and to never take the easy path, even when the easy path is paved with the scrolls of history. Stay tuned, because Hypatia's story is just beginning. Hypatia's story was just getting warmed up, much like the sizzling Mediterranean sun that bathed Alexandria in a glow as persistent as her intellectual curiosity. Now, let's dive into the part where she becomes the Beyoncé of ancient academia, headlining at the Neoplatonic school of philosophy. This was no small feat, considering that academic leadership roles were about as open to women back then as a Roman banquet was to vegetarians. First, let's talk mathematics. Hypatia didn't just dabble in numbers. She was practically their maestro. She edited the Carnics of Apollonius, which, in the simplest terms, are the geometrical musings that laid the groundwork for the later development of calculus. You know, calculus, the stuff modern high school students grimace over. Hypatia transformed these ancient texts, making them more accessible, and dare I say, less mind-numbing for her students. She was like the ancient world's answer to a YouTube math tutor, minus the quirky jump cuts and sponsorships for meal kits. But Hypatia didn't stop at mathematics. She was also a star in the astronomical arena. She's credited with designing an improved astrolabe, a device that was essentially the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world. Picture this, a gadget that could tell you the time, help you navigate the stars, and even predict the next lunar eclipse. It was Google Maps and a weather app rolled into one, minus the Wi-Fi issues. And she didn't just keep this knowledge to herself. Hypatia taught her students how to use the astrolabe, turning them into ancient GPS experts ready to chart the cosmos. Then there's her work in philosophy, which was her real ticket to the head of the Neoplatonic school. Neoplatonism, if you've never heard of it, is like Platonism with a mystical twist. Imagine Plato's ideas spiced up with a dash of metaphysical intrigue. Hypatia taught this philosophy with the flair of a TED talk speaker. She emphasized the importance of reason, a bold move in a world where superstition often held more sway than logic. Her teachings attracted scores of students, like intellectual moths to a flame, eager to bask in her wisdom. And let's not forget the societal context here. Hypatia was teaching in a city where the political climate was about as stable as a wobbly stack of papyrus scrolls. Alexandria was a hotbed of religious and cultural conflicts, with tensions simmering like a pot of stew left unattended. Yet Hypatia, with her commitment to reason and dialogue, stood as a beacon of rational thought amid the chaos. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the myths surrounding Hypatia. She's often portrayed as some mystical oracle, conjuring visions and prophecies. But the reality is less Harry Potter and more Albert Einstein. Hypatia was a scientist, not a sorceress. The allure of casting her as a magical figure is understandable. It's the stuff of legends, after all. But it does a disservice to her actual achievements. She wasn't casting spells. She was casting theorems and charting stars. Back to her role as head of the Neoplatonic school, this was a position that not only underlined her intellectual prowess, but also her political savvy. Her influence extended beyond academia. She was an advisor to political leaders, including the Roman prefect Orsts. In a city where politics was a contact sport, Hypatia's counsel was sought after, her voice respected. She was the ancient equivalent of a political strategist, minus the cable news appearances. But with great power comes great responsibility and risk. Hypatia's prominence made her a target in a city rife with intrigue and power plays, where allegiances shifted faster than the sands of the nearby desert. Her story is a reminder that being a trailblazer isn't just about breaking barriers. It's about navigating a minefield of societal expectations and dangers, all while donning the toga of rationality. So, as we continue to unravel Hypatia's extraordinary life, keep in mind that her legacy is not just about her academic triumphs. but her ability to remain a paragon of reason in a world teetering on the brink of chaos. Her life was a masterclass in balancing intellect with diplomacy, a tightrope walk that would have challenged even the most seasoned of statesmen. And remember, her tale is far from over. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into how her story unfolded against the backdrop of an Alexandria that was both a beacon of knowledge and a cauldron of conflict. As Hypatia navigated the treacherous waters of Alexandrian politics, it became clear that her intellect and influence were both her shield and her Achilles' heel. In a city where religious fervor and political ambition were as volatile a mix as oil and water, Hypatia found herself at the center of a swirling vortex of intrigue. The stakes were high, with power struggles that would make even the most seasoned Game of Thrones player break into a cold sweat. Let's set the stage. Alexandria, circa early 5th century AD, was a city caught in the throes of a cultural identity crisis. It was a place where Greek philosophical traditions clashed headlong with the burgeoning influence of Christianity, a faith that was gaining followers faster than a pop idol's Twitter account. Hypatia, a staunch advocate of Neoplatonism and rational thought, stood out like a beacon of enlightenment amid the growing shadows of dogma. Enter Orsts, the Roman governor of Alexandria, a man who, by all accounts, could have given Machiavelli a few lessons in political maneuvering. Orsts and Hypatia shared a bond forged in mutual respect for the power of reason. She was his sounding board, offering counsel in a city where political allegiance shifted more often than a sand dune in a desert storm. Together, they represented a faction that championed the old ways, pagan traditions and philosophical inquiry over the rising tide of Christian orthodoxy. But this alliance, while intellectually satisfying, was not without its hazards. Enter Cyril, the patriarch of Alexandria, a man as pious as he was pragmatic. Cyril's ambitions were as vast as the Nile, and he wielded religious influence like a sword, cutting through opposition with the fervor of a zealot chasing heretics. His relationship with Orsts was akin to a powder keg waiting to explode, with Hypatia unfortunately positioned as the match that might ignite it. Now, let's talk tactics, ancient style. If you think modern political smear campaigns are ruthless, you haven't seen anything until you've delved into the antics of early 5th century Alexandria. Rumors flew through the city like carrier pigeons with a vendetta, and Hypatia, despite her intellectual prowess, found herself caught in the crosshairs of a campaign that painted her as a sorceress, a manipulator of men and stars alike. It was the kind of slanderous gossip that would have made even the most seasoned tabloid editor blush. The allegations against Hypatia were absurd, yet strangely effective. They played on the fears and superstitions of a populace that was as likely to believe in magic as they were the rising of the sun. In a city where intellectual debate could be as dangerous as a gladiatorial contest, Hypatia's reputation was under siege. Here was a woman who lectured on the harmonies of the spheres and the intricacies of Euclidean geometry, yet she was being cast as the villain in a narrative that would have been at home in a pulp fantasy novel. So why did this matter? Because, my friends, it was a reflection of the age-old struggle between reason and superstition, a battle that echoed through the corridors of history and resonates even today. Hypatia's story is not just about her tragic end, but about the larger narrative of a society grappling with change, where old philosophies were giving way to new ideologies, and where the pursuit of knowledge was often at odds with the desire for control. In the end, Hypatia's influence was both her gift and her curse. Her presence in Orst's court was a testament to the enduring power of intellect and dialogue, yet it also highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in standing against the tide. Hypatia's tragedy was not just her own. It was a microcosm of the broader societal upheaval tearing Alexandria apart. She was a casualty in a war of ideas, a poignant reminder of the risks involved in being a beacon of reason in a world increasingly seduced by the allure of certainty. And while her life was cut short, her legacy lived on, an enduring testament to the power of knowledge and the necessity of questioning the status quo. Her story is a reminder that while the path of reason may be fraught with peril, it remains a journey worth undertaking. So, as we continue to explore Hypatia's life, remember that her influence was not just in her teachings, but in her unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the final chapters of Hypatia's remarkable story, where her legacy will continue to unfold against the backdrop of a city and a world on the cusp of profound transformation. As we dive into the murky waters of Hypatia's final days, get ready for a story that reads like a tragic opera with a dash of medieval melodrama, minus the high notes. The year was 415 AD, and Alexandria was a city that could teach a masterclass in chaos theory. It was a place where philosophical debate could lead to a street brawl faster than you could say Plato's Republic. Now, let's cut through the mythological fog that surrounds Hypatia's death. The romanticized version of events often paints her as a helpless victim, a damsel in distress swept away by the cruel winds of fate. But the truth is more nuanced, and dare I say, even more compelling. Hypatia was no shrinking violet caught in a tempest. She was a prominent figure entangled in a web of political intrigue, religious fervor, and intellectual rivalry. Picture this. The socio-political landscape of Alexandria was about as stable as a seesaw in a hurricane. Cyril of Alexandria, the patriarch with a penchant for power, wasn't just playing chess. He was flipping the entire board. He understood that controlling the spiritual narrative was akin to having the keys to the kingdom. And Hypatia, with her allegiance to rationalism and her advisory role to Orsts, was a thorn in his side, a very intellectual thorn, but a thorn nonetheless. Cyril knew that to consolidate his power, he needed to eliminate dissent and unify the city under a singular, albeit more dogmatic, vision. Hypatia, with her teachings and influence, was a symbol of the old guard, an embodiment of the intellectual freedom that was increasingly at odds with Cyril's vision for Alexandria. Her friendship with Orsts, a staunch opponent of Cyril's ecclesiastical overreach, only served to heighten tensions. The tipping point came during a fateful Lenten season. Hypatia, ever the beacon of reason, became the unfortunate scapegoat in a conflict that was as much about power as it was about piety. The rumor mill, that ancient social media of sorts, churned out tales of her sorcery. It was a classic smear campaign, the kind that makes today's political mudslinging look like playground antics. Accusations flew that Hypatia was using dark arts to manipulate Orsts, an absurd claim, especially when her real magic was education and reason. On a particularly grim day, a mob of zealots, spurred on by religious fervor and a hefty dose of misinformation, dragged Hypatia from her chariot. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculated move in a city where politics and religion were intertwined like vines around a Greek column. Hypatia was brutally murdered, her body dismembered with tiles, an act as barbaric as it was symbolic of the era's growing intolerance for intellectualism. The irony: her murder, intended to quash intellectual freedom, only highlighted its fragility. Hypatia's death marked a turning point, a chilling reminder that the pursuit of knowledge could be perilous in a world slipping into the shadows of dogma. It was a loss not just for Alexandria, but for an entire tradition of inquiry that celebrated questioning over conformity. In the aftermath, Cyril emerged stronger, his power consolidated, and Alexandria's intellectual community left reeling. Hypatia's murder was a grim milestone, a symbol of the decline of the once vibrant Alexandrian intellectual scene. The city that had been a beacon of learning and debate was now a place where the pen was not mightier than the sword, and where the clash of ideas had morphed into outright conflict. Yet, despite the tragedy, Hypatia's legacy lived on, a testament to the enduring power of reason and the human spirit's insatiable curiosity. Her story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that the battle between enlightenment and ignorance is as old as civilization itself. So, as we delve further into the annals of history, remember that Hypatia's life and death are not just relics of the past, but lessons for the present, a clarion call to value knowledge and to stand firm in its defense, even when the shadows of superstition loom large. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the threads of her legacy and the lasting impact on a world forever changed by her life and untimely demise. So, what do we make of Hypatia, the scholar extraordinaire tangled in the societal spaghetti of ancient Alexandria? Her legacy is a heady mix of fact and fable, a cocktail that's captivated historians and pop culture alike. But let's not kid ourselves. Hypatia's story is more than just the tragic footnote in the annals of history. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal tug-of-war between enlightenment and ignorance, reason and superstition. Fast forward to the Renaissance, that period of cultural rebirth when Europe's intellectual lights were learning to shine again after the dim medieval years. Hypatia became a symbol, an icon for scholars who were dusting off ancient Greek texts like they were unearthing buried treasures. Her works, especially her contributions to mathematics and philosophy, were heralded as evidence of women's intellectual prowess, a notion as revolutionary then as it was in her own time. Her death, a stark reminder of the perils faced by intellectuals standing against dogmatic tides, found resonance in an age grappling with its own share of inquisitions and witch hunts. Speaking of witch hunts, here's a fun fact. Hypatia's story was resurrected with a twist in the Enlightenment. Voltaire, that sassy French philosopher with a penchant for skewering authority, seized on her narrative as an allegory for the Church's oppressive hand over free thought. Hypatia became a poster child for the dangers of religious extremism stifling reason, a theme that, frankly, never seems to go out of style. The Enlightenment thinkers, with their powdered wigs and passion for rationalism, found in her story a rallying cry against the established order. But let's zoom into modern times. Hypatia has popped up in novels, films, and even the occasional video game, because nothing says historical accuracy like slaying digital dragons while pondering Euclidean geometry. The 2009 film Agora, starring Rachel Weisz, painted a romanticized portrait of Hypatia, casting her as a martyr for science, a narrative that's as gripping as it is embellished. The film's depiction of Hypatia as a pure paragon of reason, tragically caught in a maelstrom of fanaticism, underscores how her story continues to resonate, even if the details get a little Hollywood gloss. And why does Hypatia's story continue to grab us by the intellectual collar? Maybe it's the timeless allure of a brilliant mind confronting the ignorance of a mob, a theme that echoes through history like a refrain we can't quite shake. Or perhaps it's the poignant reminder of the thin line between enlightenment and obscurity, a balance as precarious today as it was in her time. The image of a lone scholar standing against the tide of dogma is as evocative now as it was in the shadowy streets of ancient Alexandria. But let's not sugarcoat it. The modern fascination with Hypatia sometimes skirts dangerously close to idolization without context. We love the idea of her as a lone heroine, but in doing so, we risk erasing the complexities of her life, the political machinations, the social dynamics, the very real struggle she faced as a woman in a man's world. By romanticizing her, we may overlook the gritty realities that made her story so compelling in the first place. In reflecting on Hypatia's legacy, we're invited to consider not just what she accomplished, but what we can learn, or fail to learn, from her story. She stands as a testament to the power of knowledge, yes, but also to its fragility. Her life challenges us to value intellectual freedom and to be wary of the forces that seek to suppress it. It's a lesson that history seems all too eager to repeat, despite our best intentions to the contrary. As we close the book on Hypatia's story, at least for now, let's savor the irony that centuries after her death, her story continues to evolve, much like the shifting sands of the Alexandria she once called home. Whether as a beacon of reason or a cautionary tale, Hypatia's legacy endures, reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey fraught with peril but rich with promise. And while history tends to repeat itself, perhaps her story can inspire us to break the cycle, to choose reason over dogma, and to champion the light of inquiry in a world that often prefers the comfort of shadows. In the bustling streets of ancient Cynic, a city perched on the edge of the Black Sea, a scene of fiscal drama was unfolding that would make even modern Wall Street executives wince. Enter Diogenes, the philosopher who would one day become the poster child for living simply. But before he was the ancient world's most infamous minimalist, he was just a kid caught in the middle of a financial scandal that rivaled today's corporate malfeasance. Born around 412 or 404 BCE, give or take a few years, because, let's face it, ancient birth records were about as reliable as a politician's promise. Diogenes grew up in a world where the economy was as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Sinope was a Greek colony with a front-row seat to the maritime trade routes, making it a hotbed for merchants, sailors, and the occasional swindler. Now, Diogenes' dad, Hypatia, was no ordinary citizen. He held a position in the Sinopean mint. Yes, he was the guy responsible for making sure the coins jingled, not jangled. Picture a medieval money manager with a penchant for creative accounting. The Sinopean economy was humming along just fine until he decided to spice things up a bit with some good old-fashioned currency debasement. Think of it as ancient quantitative easing, minus the fancy economics jargon. Instead of sticking to the script and minting pure silver coins, Hypatia thought it might be fun to mix in some base metals. You know, to stretch that silver a little further. It was the kind of decision that made people clutch their money bags a little tighter and eye their neighbors suspiciously. The locals, understandably, were not thrilled. The value of their hard-earned cash was plummeting faster than a lead balloon, and suddenly, Diogenes' family was the talk of the town for all the wrong reasons. As the scandal bubbled over, the political climate in Sinope turned as frosty as a Greek winter. Authorities were none too pleased with Hypatia's monetary mischief, and it wasn't long before Diogenes found himself exiled alongside his father. Talk about a family vacation gone wrong. Exile in the ancient world wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was essentially a boot out the door with a sign saying, "Good luck. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." So, off they went, leaving behind the familiar streets of Sinope for a world that was as uncertain as a dice roll. While many might have seen this as a time for despair, Diogenes took it in stride. After all, when life gives you lemons, or in this case, a one-way ticket to nowhere, you can either cry over spilled milk or make some philosophical lemonade. This early upheaval in Diogenes' life set the stage for the development of his later philosophies. The economic shenanigans of Sinope weren't just a backdrop. They were a crash course in the fragility of wealth and the folly of human greed. It was a lesson he took to heart, shaping his disdain for materialism and his embrace of a life lived with just the basics. Diogenes would later become known for his radical views, but his early life was a testament to the fact that sometimes losing everything you thought you needed is the best way to discover what you really can't live without. In the end, the Sinopean currency debacle was more than just a financial disaster. It was the crucible that forged one of history's most eccentric philosophers. Diogenes might have started his journey as the son of a disgraced mint official, but he would go on to challenge the norms and values of society in a way that still resonates today. And while the citizens of Sinope may not have appreciated Hypatia's economic creativity, Diogenes' legacy as the ultimate cynic would ensure that his story was far from over. So, Diogenes, freshly booted from Sinope, set sail for Athens, which was, at the time, a bustling hub of philosophy and questionable hygiene. Picture a city where democracy was still figuring out the whole people power thing, and the air was thick with ideas, and probably a fair amount of dust. The timeline's a bit fuzzy. Ancient historians weren't exactly synchronized with their calendars, but let's say it was around the mid-4th century BCE when Diogenes arrived, with a philosophical toolkit as empty as his pockets. Speaking of which, Diogenes wasn't just traveling light. He was traveling ultra-minimalist. Forget the barrel myth. Our man Diogenes opted for a large ceramic jar, a pithos to call home. This wasn't some cozy, rustic cottage. It was more like living in a giant flower pot. Why? Because Diogenes was on a mission to show the world that you didn't need a 3-bedroom villa to find happiness. If anything, he was the original, tiny home influencer, centuries before Instagram made it cool. Now, let's talk about the whole living-in-a-jar business. It wasn't just a stunt, though it did make for a great conversation starter. Diogenes was a cynic, and for him, that meant living in accordance with nature, stripped of society's pretensions and excesses. The cynics were like the ancient world's reality check, calling out the absurdities of social conventions with a philosophy that's as harsh as a Spartan boot camp. Diogenes took this to heart, or perhaps to jar, embracing poverty not as a misfortune, but as liberation from the shackles of materialism. Athens, with its agora teeming with philosophers, politicians, and more than a few charlatans, must have been a playground for Diogenes' antics. He was known for carrying a lamp in broad daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man. Spoiler alert, he never found one. But this wasn't just an exercise in futility. It was a biting critique of Athenian society, a place where reality often wore a mask more than a face. The guy wasn't just a philosopher. He was a social media feed come to life, trolling his contemporaries with the kind of sharp wit that would have made Oscar Wilde nod in approval. One of his more famous run-ins was with Plato. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes promptly plucked a chicken and declared, "Here is Plato's human." Plato, presumably, wasn't amused, though you have to give Diogenes points for creativity. In his quest to live a life unencumbered by societal norms, Diogenes embraced a kind of provocative asceticism. He begged for his meals, relying on the generosity, or perhaps the guilt, of the Athenians, and he was often seen eating in public, something scandalous at the time. To Diogenes, these acts were more than just rebellion. They were a statement that societal norms were constructs, often as flimsy as the toga he might have worn. Cynic philosophy wasn't just about rejecting material wealth. It was about questioning everything that society held dear. For Diogenes, this meant living with virtue as the ultimate goal, not wealth, power, or pleasure. The Cynics believed in self-sufficiency, a kind of inner freedom that external comforts could never provide. It's like they were the ultimate DIY ethicists, crafting a life philosophy with whatever was at hand, or not at hand, in Diogenes' case. Yet, Diogenes wasn't entirely a lone wolf howling at the societal moon. His interactions with the people of Athens were as much a part of his philosophy as the thoughts themselves. Take, for instance, his encounter with Alexander the Great. When the Macedonian conqueror, reportedly impressed by Diogenes' reputation, offered to grant him any wish, Diogenes simply replied, "Stand out of my sunlight." It's the kind of mic drop moment that would have gone viral today, a testament to a man who refused to bow to power or prestige. Despite, or maybe because of, his unconventional lifestyle, Diogenes left a mark on Athens and beyond. He was a living critique of the status quo, a reminder that human happiness and fulfillment don't come pre-packaged with a price tag. In a world where wealth was often equated with success, Diogenes showed that true richness lay in the freedom from such illusions. As the sun set over the Athenian skyline, casting long shadows over the city, Diogenes' jar must have seemed a strange but fitting beacon of his philosophy. Here was a man who lived as he preached, unbothered by the trappings of wealth or status, content in his own skin, or jar, as it were. The Athenians might have found him odd, even maddening at times, but they couldn't ignore him. In a city full of voices clamoring to be heard, Diogenes stood out not for what he had, but for all he chose to do without. So, as the story of Diogenes continues to unfold, remember, sometimes the most profound truths come not wrapped in gold leaf, but in the earthy simplicity of a clay jar. Yet, as the story of Diogenes continues to unfold, remember, sometimes the most profound truths come not wrapped in gold leaf, but in the earthy simplicity of a clay jar. And speaking of earthy simplicity, let's wander into the realm of historical legend and reality, a place where Diogenes' encounters with the great and powerful become the stuff of philosophical folklore. First up, let's set our sights on Diogenes' legendary meeting with Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander wasn't just any old conqueror with a sword and a dream. By the time he was 20, he'd already inherited the Macedonian throne, and by 30, he was busy carving out an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt and beyond into the heart of Asia. Picture a guy with a to-do list that included things like defeat Persia and become a living god. Casual, right? So here we have young Alexander, the ancient world's biggest celebrity, who decides to pay a visit to the infamous philosopher in Athens. Why? Perhaps he was curious, or maybe he just needed a break from the relentless empire building. The scene goes something like this. Alexander, surrounded by his entourage, approaches Diogenes, who is sunning himself like a human lizard outside his jar. Alexander, in what can only be described as a royal attempt at magnanimity, offers to grant Diogenes any wish. And what does our cynic philosopher ask for? Stand out of my sunlight. Boom, mic drop. This encounter has been told and retold through the ages, morphing into a parable about the meeting of ultimate power and ultimate simplicity. But let's pause here. Did it really happen this way? The details are murkier than a muddy Athenian street after a rainstorm. Ancient sources like Diogenes Laertius and Plutarch give us the goods, but let's not forget that these guys were writing years after the fact. Still, whether or not every word was spoken exactly as recorded, the exchange captures the essence of Diogenes' philosophy, a life unfettered by the trappings of power or prestige. In fact, Diogenes' life was a living critique of the Alexanders of the world. While the young conqueror was busy amassing territories and titles, Diogenes was stripping life down to its bare bones, showing that true freedom wasn't found in palaces or armies, but in the ability to say, "I have enough." It's like the original minimalist manifesto, ages before Marie Kondo started sparking joy. But the meeting with Alexander wasn't Diogenes' only brush with fame. Oh no, the man had a knack for poking the bear, whether that bear wore a crown or a philosopher's robe. Take, for instance, his encounters with Plato, the student of Socrates, and a guy who was no stranger to lofty ideas. Diogenes wasn't impressed by Plato's intellectual airs or his academy, which was less school and more exclusive think tank. When Plato defined a human as a featherless biped, Diogenes, never one to miss an opportunity for mischief, plucked a chicken and waltzed into the academy declaring, "Behold, Plato's man." It's the sort of antic that would have earned him a permanent ban from your average academic conference today. This wasn't just about ruffling feathers, literally and figuratively, but about challenging the status quo. Diogenes was a master of using humor to undercut pretentiousness, a kind of ancient stand-up comedian with a philosophical punchline. His antics were a way to expose the absurdity of societal norms and the often arbitrary nature of intellectual definitions. Now, let's head back to the economic realities of the ancient world, because understanding Diogenes' philosophy also means understanding the context he lived in, a time when wealth was often synonymous with virtue, and poverty was seen as moral failure. Diogenes' radical simplicity was a direct challenge to these assumptions. He wasn't just rejecting material wealth. He was flipping the script on what it meant to live a good life. To many Athenians, Diogenes must have seemed like a walking contradiction, a penniless philosopher who claimed to possess everything he needed. But his lifestyle was more than just a personal choice. It was a commentary on the economic disparities of his time. While the elite dined on fine foods and draped themselves in costly fabrics, Diogenes demonstrated that happiness wasn't something you could purchase, but something you cultivated within. His life was a testament to the idea that true freedom came not from accumulating wealth, but from shedding the chains of desire and expectation. It's like Diogenes was the original dropout from the rat race, centuries before anyone coined the term. And while his methods were unconventional, to say the least, his message resonated, echoing through the ages like a bell ringing in a quiet room. Diogenes' interactions with the powerful and the pretentious weren't just personal spats. They were part of a larger philosophical mission. He was a living reminder that the emperor often has no clothes, that the values society holds dear are sometimes as flimsy as a toga. And while his methods were often abrasive, his message was one of liberation from the illusions that bind us. So, as we continue to unpack the life and times of Diogenes, remember that his story is one of contrasts and contradictions, a blend of myth and reality that challenges us to look beyond the surface. In a world obsessed with status and wealth, Diogenes dared to live a life that was radically different, a life that continues to inspire and provoke us today. As we move forward, let's keep an eye on the next chapter of his story, which promises to be as intriguing and unpredictable as the man himself. Now, as Diogenes' tale continues, let's pack up his metaphorical jar and set our sights on Corinth, a city that didn't just dabble in philosophical pursuits, but rolled out the whole intellectual red carpet. By the time Diogenes made Corinth his philosophical stomping ground, the city was a buzzing intersection of trade and thought, much like an ancient TED conference, albeit with more togas and fewer PowerPoints. Diogenes arrived in Corinth around the late 4th century BCE, a place where merchant ships docked as frequently as new ideas. Corinth was not just a commercial powerhouse, but also a place where philosophers could chew the fat, if they had any. Here, Diogenes' influence began to ripple outward, much like the waves lapping against the Corinthian harbor. It was in this vibrant milieu that Diogenes found both an audience and a few like-minded souls who would carry the torch of cynicism into new territories. Enter Crates of Thebes, not just a follower, but a full-on disciple of Diogenes. Crates wasn't your run-of-the-mill philosopher. He hailed from a wealthy family, but decided that living like a king wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Inspired by Diogenes, Crates gave up his wealth faster than you could say inheritance tax and embraced a life of asceticism. If Diogenes was the original minimalist, Crates was his star pupil, eager to prove that happiness wasn't stored in a treasure chest, but in a life unburdened by material possessions. Crates' devotion to Diogenes' teachings was so intense that he even had a nickname, the Door Opener. This wasn't just because he had a knack for metaphorically opening minds, but because he literally lived his life in the open, without doors or walls to constrain him. Crates' own lifestyle was as stark as Diogenes', and he often wandered the streets in ragged clothing, living out the Cynic ideal of shamelessness and self-sufficiency. Then there was Zeno of Citium, a figure who would take the seeds of Cynic philosophy and plant them in the fertile ground of what would become Stoicism. Zeno, hailing from Cyprus, was initially a merchant whose shipwreck led him to Athens, and subsequently to the feet of Crates. Imagine that, losing everything at sea only to find a new philosophical anchor in the teachings of the Cynics. It was like a cosmic nudge, steering him toward a life less concerned with cargo and more with character. Zeno absorbed Cynic lessons like a philosophical sponge, yet he wasn't content to simply echo them. Instead, he expanded upon them, laying the groundwork for a new school of thought that emphasized inner virtue and rationality. While Diogenes taught that virtue was the sole good, Zeno added layers of discipline and logic, crafting Stoicism into a robust framework that would captivate minds from Rome to the Renaissance. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to Diogenes and his time in Corinth. His influence wasn't just limited to students and followers. His very presence in the city was like an intellectual gust of wind, sweeping through the cobbled streets and stirring up conversations about what it meant to live a good life. Diogenes was a walking billboard for authenticity, a stark contrast to the polished facades of Corinthian society. He challenged the entrenched norms and values, much like a philosophical iconoclast smashing idols with his words. Yet, what made Diogenes truly remarkable was his ability to provoke reflection through simplicity. He wasn't about complex treatises or exhaustive scrolls. His philosophy was lived, not just written. When he paraded through Corinth with a lantern in broad daylight, claiming to search for an honest man, it wasn't just a stunt. It was a critique of the hypocrisy he saw around him, a reminder that virtue wasn't about appearances but actions. In Corinth, Diogenes' lifestyle was a direct affront to the excesses of wealth and the illusion of status. His utter indifference to material comforts was a sharp rebuke to a society that equated success with accumulation. He lived off the land and public charity, demonstrating that true freedom was found in the rejection of societal pressures, not in their embrace. His life was a masterclass in prioritizing substance over style, a lesson that resonated with those weary of the rat race. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at the broader impact of cynicism during the Hellenistic period. The era, marked by the spread of Greek culture across the Mediterranean and the Near East, was a time of great intellectual ferment. In this context, cynicism acted as both a philosophical gadfly and a moral compass. While other schools offered complex metaphysical systems, the Cynics took a more direct approach. They were the ancient world's reality check, a reminder that the quest for wisdom often began with questioning the very foundations of society. Diogenes' disdain for convention and authority found echoes in the hearts of those disillusioned by the power structures of the time. The Cynics were like the punk rockers of philosophy, shaking up the establishment with their radical simplicity and unapologetic authenticity. They challenged the notion that virtue could be bought or bartered, insisting instead that it was a state of being achieved through rigorous self-examination and disciplined living. Cynicism's influence on Hellenistic philosophy was profound. Its emphasis on living in accordance with nature and embracing virtue as the highest good would find its way into Stoicism, which in turn would shape the ethical frameworks of later Roman thinkers. Diogenes' legacy, therefore, was not just a personal philosophy, but a catalyst for broader intellectual currents that would ripple through history. But let's not romanticize too much. Cynicism wasn't for everyone. Its harsh critique of society was often met with resistance and ridicule. The Cynics' rejection of social norms was seen by many as an affront to decency, their asceticism as a denial of life's pleasures. Yet, it was precisely this willingness to challenge the status quo that made cynicism a compelling alternative for those seeking a deeper understanding of what it meant to live well. In the end, Diogenes' life and philosophy were a testament to the power of ideas to transcend their time and place. His unwavering commitment to living authentically, regardless of the cost, was a radical act of defiance against the superficial values of his day. As we wrap up this chapter of his life, let's keep in mind that Diogenes' story is far from over. His influence continues to challenge and inspire, a reminder that sometimes the simplest truths are the most profound. So, as we prepare to delve into the final chapters of Diogenes' journey, remember that his legacy isn't just about the life he lived, but the lives he touched and the ideas he sparked. Stay tuned as we explore the enduring impact of his philosophy and the ways it continues to resonate in our modern world. And so, as we wrap ourselves firmly in the philosophical toga of Diogenes, let's unravel the tangled threads of his enduring impact on Western thought. You might think that a guy who lived in a jar and asked Alexander the Great to move over would fade into historical obscurity, but you'd be wrong. Diogenes' ideas have been bouncing around the corridors of intellectual history like a particularly determined rubber ball, refusing to sit quietly on the shelf next to dusty scrolls and forgotten names. First, let's tackle how Diogenes' life has been romanticized over the centuries. Picture a world where philosophers aren't just thinkers, but outright rebels. Diogenes is the poster boy for this movement. His disdain for material wealth and societal norms painted him as a kind of intellectual anarchist. It's no wonder that over time, his image has been polished to a sheen that would make a museum curator proud. Diogenes becomes less a man and more a myth, the guy who lived his truth so loudly that even time couldn't drown him out. Think of him as the original rock star philosopher, smashing societal conventions like guitars on stage. But as we all know, myths are like those Instagram filters. They smooth over the rough edges. The reality, well, it's a bit grittier. Living in a jar sounds quaint until you consider the Athenian winters or the fact that your neighbors might not appreciate the open-door policy in a city where sanitation was more of a suggestion than a standard. Yet, the myth endures because it appeals to the part of us that yearns to break free from the mundane. Diogenes is the ultimate, I do what I want icon, flipping the bird to societal expectations. Now, let's shift gears and examine Diogenes' philosophical legacy. Cynicism, as a school of thought, wasn't just a flash in the Athenian pan. It laid the groundwork for Stoicism, which, as you might know, became the philosophical equivalent of a bestseller in ancient Rome, thanks to figures like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. The Cynic emphasis on living in harmony with nature and rejecting societal excesses was given a more structured, rational twist by the Stoics. They took Diogenes' raw philosophical clay and sculpted it into something that resonated with the Roman elite. It's like Cynicism was the garage band that inspired the polished studio album of Stoicism. But what about today? Does Diogenes' brand of cynicism still hold water in our modern world, where the idea of minimalism is often just another excuse to buy expensive storage solutions? In some ways, yes. The essence of cynicism, a life lived according to nature and free from the shackles of material possessions, still speaks to those weary of consumer culture and the relentless pursuit of more. In a society where happiness is often measured by the latest gadget or social media-like count, Diogenes' message of simplicity and authenticity cuts through the noise like a philosophical machete. Yet, it's not all sunshine and philosophical enlightenment. The appeal of cynicism is often romanticized, glossing over the harshness of a life lived with so little. Sure, living minimally sounds great until you realize that means no Netflix, no artisanal coffee, and definitely no Wi-Fi. Diogenes' reality was one of begging and public scorn, a far cry from the curated simplicity we often admire. It's a stark reminder that the path less traveled is often less traveled for a reason. It's hard, it's lonely, and it involves a lot more grit than glamour. Diogenes' legacy is also a reminder of the power of ideas to transcend their time. His life was a masterclass in challenging the status quo, questioning everything from political structures to personal ethics. In a world where conformity often feels like the path of least resistance, Diogenes stands as a beacon of unapologetic authenticity. His philosophy encourages us to strip away the non-essential, to focus on what truly matters, and to live in a way that is true to ourselves. regardless of societal pressures. So, as we close the book on Diogenes' story, let's take a moment to appreciate the complexity of his legacy. He's a figure who defies easy categorization, both a myth and a man, a rebel and a philosopher, a product of his time, and yet timeless in his ideals. His life challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question the values we hold dear, and to live with a boldness that refuses to be tamed by convention. In the end, Diogenes' life was a testament to the power of living authentically, regardless of the cost. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was over 2 millennia ago, a reminder that the true measure of a life well lived isn't found in what we possess, but in how we choose to live. So, as you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of Diogenes' philosophy linger, inspiring you to question, to challenge, and to live with a courage that refuses to be silenced. You're waking up in the eternal city, where the morning sun shines over Rome's ancient rooftops like a spirited emperor casting his benevolent gaze. But today isn't just any day. It's game day at the Colosseum. Forget the modern Super Bowl with its overpriced hot dogs and plastic seats. This is where 50,000 Romans will gather for a spectacle of blood and glory. And trust me, getting there is half the adventure. First, let's talk logistics, because stepping out your front door in Rome isn't just about heading to the corner store. It's more like navigating a bustling marketplace of humanity. Narrow streets teem with vendors hawking everything from olives to amphorae of fish sauce. You think rush hour traffic is bad? Try dodging a parade of chariots, eager spectators, and the occasional stray goat. The air is a heady mix of excitement and the unmistakable aroma of smoked meats and sweat. This is the scent of anticipation. Now, unless you're the patrician equivalent of a couch potato, you're probably on foot. Sure, you could be riding in a litter carried by slaves, but that's really for the upper crust who prefer their excitement without the inconvenience of actual exercise. Plus, in a city where the rich hold banquets that would make a Roman senator weep, walking is a welcome calorie burner. The average Roman citizen covers about 3 miles from their insula or apartment block to the Colosseum, and with sandals that are more fashionably functional than practical, every step feels like you're earning that front row view of combat. As you make your way through the throng, it's clear this isn't just a stroll to a stadium, it's a pilgrimage. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater, if you're trying to impress your friends at dinner parties, stands as a monumental feat of engineering. Finished in 80 AD, this architectural titan spans 620 feet in length and towers 157 feet high. You can almost feel the ground tremble not just from the size, but from the collective anticipation of those eager to see man versus beast, gladiator versus gladiator, and maybe even a naval battle if the rumors are true and someone remembered to plug the drains. But let's not romanticize this too much. While the Colosseum is indeed a marvel, it's not exactly a 5-star experience. You've got 50,000 spectators crammed in like olives in a jar. And speaking of olives, today's menu is likely bread, cheese, and the odd fruit. If you're lucky, some enterprising vendor will sell you wine that could double as paint thinner. Yet it's not about comfort, it's about the spectacle. To get a sense of the scale, consider this. The Colosseum could empty in 50 minutes flat, thanks to its 80 entrances. A feat modern stadiums barely manage with all their fancy exits and electronic signs. The Romans designed it with the kind of efficiency that would make a Swiss watchmaker blush. This wasn't just about crowd control. It was about showing off Roman ingenuity and dominance, because there's nothing like a bit of architectural prowess to remind you who's boss. Now, while you're jostling for a spot amidst the throng, here's a quick reality check. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of entertainment, it was a political tool. Emperors used the games to curry favor with the masses, to distract them from the empire's more pressing problems, like economic inequality and the occasional barbarian invasion. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal famously put it, were the keys to keeping the populace content and, more importantly, compliant. So while you're caught up in the roar of the crowd, remember, the spectacle is just as much about control as it is about entertainment. Speaking of control, let's bust some myths. You might have heard tales of Christians being fed to lions, but evidence suggests that's more legend than fact. Sure, there were executions and dramatic displays, but the whole Christian lion narrative has been spiced up over the centuries like an overzealous chef seasoning his stew. The truth is less fantastical, but no less brutal. Criminals, prisoners of war, and unlucky gladiators bore the brunt of the Colosseum's bloodlust. As you approach the entrance, the vastness of the structure becomes even more apparent. The sheer scale of the operation is mind-boggling. Hundreds of workers, from architects to laborers, dedicated years to its construction, using over 100,000 cubic meters of travertine stone. It's the kind of project that makes you wonder if ancient Rome had a secret stash of caffeine to keep everyone going. Inside, the atmosphere is electric. You find your seat, a stone slab that's warmer from the sun than from any notion of comfort. Here, social hierarchy is as clear as the blue Roman sky. The closer you are to the action, the higher your status. Senators and other VIPs occupy the best views, while the plebeians like you are seated higher up. But hey, it's better than being outside the arena, where you'd only hear the roars and feel the vibrations of the crowd. As you settle in, you can't help but marvel at the anticipation, the palpable excitement in the air. This isn't just a show, it's a shared experience, a testament to the power and spectacle of Rome at its most grandiose. It's a day where you lose yourself in the crowd, in the noise, in the sheer thrill of being part of something bigger than any one person. And as the first combatants make their grand entrance, you forget about the uncomfortable seating and the sweat-drenched tunic. You're here, amidst the majesty and madness, ready to cheer, gasp, and be swept away by the grand spectacle of the Colosseum, Rome's ultimate display of might and entertainment. Now, as the first gladiator steps into the arena, you think the crowd will be unified, a singular roar of anticipation. But this is Rome, where even a simple seating arrangement is a microcosm of societal stratification. Guess what? Your spot in the Colosseum says more about your social standing than a modern LinkedIn profile. Up close and personal with the action are the senators and patricians, the Roman elite who can afford front-row seats without breaking a sweat or a denarius. These power players sit in the lower three tiers, with the emperor himself often gracing the most central and prestigious barks, the pulvinar. It's like having bark seats at the Super Bowl, but with more blood and fewer commercials. Here, the emperor is not just another spectator. He's the ringmaster, a living symbol of imperial power and benevolence. At least, that's what the PR scrolls would have you believe. Now, if you were a knight or an equestrian, Rome's middle management, if you will, you'd find your seats a little further back. Not quite rubbing shoulders with the emperor, but hey, still close enough to feel the spray of sand kicked up by a charging chariot. Equestrians have enough clout to avoid the plebeian crush, yet remain just distant enough to remind them of their place in the pecking order. And then there's the rest of us, the plebs, the hoi polloi, the great unwashed masses. We're up in the nosebleeds, where the air gets thin, and the view is mostly obstructed by the backs of those who had the foresight or fortune to be born into the right family. But let's not get too cynical. These seats have their own charm. You're part of a community, a collective cheer or boo that rolls down the arena like a wave. It's a place where you can lose yourself in the anonymity of the crowd, where your voice, though one of many, helps fuel the frenzy below. Let's talk about the logistics of these arrangements. It wasn't just a free-for-all. There were assigned seats, and not just because Romans loved order, though they did. The seating plan was a visual representation of Rome's rigid social hierarchy. Different sections were demarcated by status, gender, and even attire. Women, for example, were relegated to the upper tiers unless they were Vestal virgins, who had a front-row spot due to their religious significance. It's a bit like being forced to watch from the cheap seats unless you've taken a vow of chastity and dedicated your life to maintaining the sacred flame. Choices. But how did you snag one of these seats? Well, entry to the Colosseum was technically free, a clever tactic by emperors to curry favor with the populace. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of a political campaign rally, but instead of balloons and confetti, you get gladiators and wild beasts. However, getting a good seat, that's where things got interesting. Social connections and patronage played a huge role. Tickets were distributed through a complex web of favors and obligations, making the seating process less like buying a ticket online and more like navigating a Byzantine bureaucracy with a side of nepotism. Now, despite the free entry, attending these games wasn't entirely without cost. Let's factor in the economic realities here. While you didn't have to shell out for a ticket, you'd likely spend a decent amount on the peripheral expenses: food, drink, and the odd trinket to commemorate the occasion. Vendors roamed the stands selling everything from roasted nuts to garum, a fish sauce so pungent it could double as a weapon. And let's not forget the wine, a necessity for many to endure the day-long spectacles. The wine wasn't exactly top-tier vintage. It was more like the boxed variety of the ancient world. But when in Rome, right, the parallels with today's stadium experiences are uncanny. Just like modern events, where the ticket is only part of the expense, a day at the Colosseum could quickly drain your purse if you weren't careful. But back in the day, it was a price many were willing to pay for a slice of the action. After all, the games were more than just entertainment. They were a chance to be part of something larger, to see and be seen, to cheer for your favorite gladiator, and for a brief moment, escape the mundane grind of Roman life. As the morning sun climbs higher, the games continue, and the social dynamics within these stone walls play out like a well-rehearsed drama. The emperor might throw a lavish banquet for the senators, while the plebs barter for a better spot to catch a glimpse of the action. It's all part of the spectacle, a dance of social politics as intricate as any gladiatorial combat. Yet, amidst the grandeur and the gore, it's easy to forget that this is also a stage for political maneuvering. The games weren't just about keeping the masses entertained. They were a strategic tool in the emperor's arsenal to maintain control. By offering these lavish spectacles, emperors could distract the populace from the empire's less glamorous issues, like rising taxes, political corruption, and those pesky barbarian threats on the horizon. In this grand arena, the boundaries between spectacle and politics blur, creating a theater where the stakes are as high as the cheers are loud. It's a testament to the power of performance, a reminder that while the games may have ended, the echoes of their social and political implications reverberate through history. And as the dust settles on the morning's battles, the crowd, ever hungry for more, waits with bated breath for the next act in this ancient drama. You, among them, are not just a spectator, but a participant in this grand narrative, caught up in the rhythms of Rome's most extravagant show. The day is far from over, and there are more tales to be told, more myths to unravel, more truths to uncover, as the Colosseum continues to captivate and enthrall, an enduring symbol of Rome's might and its mysteries. As the dust from the morning's battle settles, you're suddenly aware of the sensory bombardment that is the Colosseum on game day. The roar of the crowd is a beast of its own, a symphony of shouts, cheers, and the occasional groan of disappointment. It's the kind of noise that makes you wonder how anyone ever heard themselves think in ancient Rome, or maybe that was the point. Amidst this cacophony, the smell of street food invades your nostrils like a well-coordinated assault. Forget modern stadium cuisine. Here, the corridors are alive with the earthy aroma of roasted nuts, spiced meats, and enough garum to keep a fishmonger's guild in business. You might think this sensory overload would be overwhelming, but for the Romans, it was just another day at the amphitheater. They had their own strategies to cope. For starters, a little social maneuvering went a long way. Befriend the right vendor, and you might find yourself with a prime spot to snag the first batch of hot sausages, the kind that only slightly tastes like the ashes they were cooked over. If you're savvy enough, you might even barter your way into a better seat with a couple of amphorae of that infamous Roman paint-thinner wine. Let's not forget about the vendors themselves, the unsung heroes of this chaotic dance. They navigated the stands with the agility of a gladiator and the charm of a seasoned politician. With a shout here and a nudge there, they hawked their wares, peddling everything from figs to dates to what might generously be called wine. These vendors knew their audience. They had to. With 50,000 potential customers, a Roman entrepreneur had to stand out or get left behind faster than a gladiator who forgot his sword. And then there were the entertainers, because even a blood-soaked spectacle needs a halftime show. Jugglers, acrobats, and musicians roamed the stands, keeping the energy alive during breaks in the action. You might catch a glimpse of a fire eater, whose performance was as much about the danger as it was about the distraction. It wasn't just about filling the silence. It was about maintaining the energy, keeping the crowd teetering on the edge of excitement and chaos. Now, you might be wondering how anyone coped with the sheer chaos of it all. Well, necessity is the mother of invention, and Romans were nothing if not inventive. For one, they devised ingenious ways to stay comfortable, or as comfortable as one could be while perched on a stone slab baking in the midday sun. Some brought cushions or blankets to soften the unforgiving stone. Others were more resourceful, using the program scrolls, handed out at the entrance, as makeshift fans to combat the heat. Hydration, too, was a concern, especially under the blazing Roman sun. Water sellers roamed the stands, and though the water wasn't always what you might call fresh, it was wet, and that was good enough for most. The more discerning might opt for pasca, a mix of vinegar and water that was surprisingly refreshing and a favorite among Roman soldiers. It's the ancient world's version of a sports drink, minus the electrolytes and marketing. Speaking of marketing, let's talk about the Colosseum's unsung economic engine, the betting scene. While the official stance was that gambling was frowned upon, you better believe there were denarii exchanging hands faster than you could say, Ave Caesar. It was as much a part of the spectacle as the games themselves. Betting on gladiators was a risky business, but the potential rewards were enough to tempt even the most frugal plebeian. After all, what's a day at the games without a little gamble? And let's not overlook the political undertones. The games weren't just about entertainment, they were a power play, a way for emperors to flex their political muscle and remind the populace who was in charge. The crowd's reactions were as much a barometer of public mood as they were a reflection of the day's events. A raucous cheer for a gladiator could be as much a jab at the current regime as it was support for the fighter. Now, you might be thinking, surely, not everyone was swept up in the madness. And you'd be right. While many were there for the thrill, some Romans attended the games with a more philosophical bent. Stoics, for example, might view the spectacle as an exercise in endurance, a test of their ability to remain detached amid chaos. Others saw it as a reflection of life's impermanence, a reminder that glory and defeat are two sides of the same coin. But for most Romans, the games were an escape, a chance to lose themselves in the spectacle, if only for a few hours. It was a day where social barriers blurred, where the plebeian could rub shoulders, literally, with the equestrian, at least until the next fight started. The Colosseum was a microcosm of Roman society, a place where fortunes could be made or lost, where reputations were forged in the crucible of public opinion. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the arena floor, the games continued, each bout more thrilling than the last. The crowd, ever hungry for more, leaned in, caught up in the rhythm of the spectacle. And you, just another face in the throng, were swept along, a willing participant in Rome's grand narrative. In the end, the Colosseum was more than just a venue for blood sport. It was an institution, an integral part of Roman life. It was a place where heroes were born, where the line between myth and reality blurred, where the echoes of cheers and cries became part of the city's heartbeat. And as the day drew to a close, you couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale of it all, a testament to Rome's power, its people, and its enduring legacy. But as the dust settled and the crowds began to disperse, the day was far from over. The city awaited, with its own stories to tell, its own challenges to face. And as you made your way back through the bustling streets, the echoes of the Colosseum ringing in your ears, you knew that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new tales, new myths to unravel. Because in Rome, the spectacle never truly ends. As you make your way back through the bustling streets, the echoes of the Colosseum ringing in your ears, let's slice through the sensationalized tapestry of myths and get to the gritty reality of those legendary games. First, let's tackle the crowd pleaser, gladiator deaths. Contrary to the Hollywood image of gladiators dropping like flies, most of these fierce combatants lived to fight another day. Hard to believe, right? But here's the kicker. Historians estimate that only 10% of matches ended in death. Sure, 10% is nothing to scoff at, unless you're thinking of a modern-day sporting event where that would be, well, catastrophic. But it's far from the bloodbath you might envision. Gladiators were akin to sports stars, with fans, sponsors, and yes, even endorsement deals. They weren't just fodder for the lions. These guys were investments. Owners, or Lannisty, shelled out a decent sum to train and maintain them. So a gladiator's death was like burning money, spectacular but unsustainable. Plus, frequent deaths would have left Rome scrambling for new fighters faster than a merchant at a going-out-of-business sale. Now, about those beasts. It's true, the Colosseum hosted some wild and woolly spectacles, from bear baiting to staged hunts or venations, featuring everything from elephants to gazelles. These events were less about man versus beast, and more about showcasing Rome's mastery over nature and the far reaches of its empire. Think of them as an ancient version of a Discovery Channel special, just with a bit more blood and a lot more bravado. Let's not forget the naval battles, or Normatia, held in the Colosseum. Yes, you heard that right. Naval battles in an amphitheater. Romans temporarily flooded the arena to recreate maritime warfare, a testament to their engineering prowess, and let's be real, their penchant for the theatrical. These events weren't common, though. They were costly, logistically nightmarish, and reserved for special occasions. But man, did they make a splash when they happened. Literally. In the world of Roman spectacles, it wasn't just about the fight. It was about the story. Gladiators were given personas, backstories that added drama and intrigue. The Murmillo with his fish-shaped helmet, the Rashirius with his net and trident, each brought a unique flavor to the arena. It was part of the show's allure, a narrative woven into the spectacle to keep audiences on the edge of their stone seats. And let's talk about the real puppet masters behind these spectacles, the emperors. The games were more than mere distraction. They were a tool of manipulation, a way to consolidate power and placate the masses. Emperor Titus, for instance, inaugurated the Colosseum with 100 days of games, throwing open the gates to spectacle and slaughter. It was a PR move worthy of a modern-day political strategist. Gain the people's favor, and you gain control. Bread and circuses, after all, weren't just about filling bellies and minds. They were about controlling them. There's an irony here, though. In the quest to entertain and maintain power, emperors inadvertently created a space for social commentary. The audience, while thrilled by the action, could also see through the charade. The games became a mirror reflecting the empire's grandeur and its brutality, a stage for both entertainment and subtle dissent. The cheers weren't always just for the gladiators. Sometimes they were a veiled commentary on the political climate. A day at the games was a whirlwind of politics, spectacle, and social commentary, wrapped up in the guise of entertainment. It was a microcosm of Roman society, where the boundaries between reality and performance blurred. As you walk away from the Colosseum, the sun dipping low on the horizon, it's clear the games were more than just a pastime. They were a complex dance of power, propaganda, and public perception. As the city of Rome continues to pulse with life, the Colosseum stands as a monument to both human ingenuity and folly. It's a reminder that history, much like those ancient games, is a mix of myth and reality, spectacle and substance. And as the day fades into night, you can't help but wonder what new stories tomorrow will bring, what new myths will be born and debunked in this eternal city. As you wander away from the Colosseum, that ancient monument still looming large in your mind's eye, it's hard not to marvel at its enduring allure. Here's a structure that's been standing for nearly 2 millennia, and yet it feels as alive in our imaginations today as it did back then. The Colosseum, with its tales of valor and viciousness, isn't just a relic. It's a cultural icon, a touchstone of human history that continues to capture the imagination of millions. But why, you might ask, does this brutal arena still hold such a grip on us? Well, for starters, let's talk about the sheer spectacle of it all. The Colosseum was the ancient world's version of a blockbuster movie, a place where larger-than-life characters and epic tales unfolded before tens of thousands of eager spectators. It's the drama, the danger, the sheer unpredictability that still resonates with us. After all, who doesn't love a good story of heroism and hubris, where the stakes are life and death, and the outcome is anything but certain? But beyond the blood and sand, the Colosseum is a testament to Rome's engineering prowess and its flair for the dramatic. This was a society that knew how to put on a show, and boy, did they deliver. With its 80 entrances, retractable awnings, and sophisticated crowd control mechanisms, the Colosseum was a marvel of ancient innovation. It's no wonder it remains one of the world's most visited tourist sites, drawing over 7 million visitors a year. Take that, modern stadiums. Yet, while we're drawn to its grandeur and its stories, we also romanticize the games themselves. Hollywood loves a good gladiator movie, and who can resist the allure of a lone warrior standing against insurmountable odds? But here's the thing. That romantic image is as much fiction as fact. The games were brutal, bloody, and very much a tool of political control. They served to reinforce the power of the emperors, distract the populace from the empire's problems, and maintain social order. It was less about individual glory and more about the spectacle of dominance, both human and imperial. Still, this doesn't diminish their place in our cultural consciousness. Instead, it adds layers to our understanding. The Colosseum is a mirror, reflecting our fascination with extremes of power, of violence, of human endurance. It's a reminder of our capacity for both creation and destruction, for spectacle and suffering. And in that duality, we find something deeply human. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the people who filled those stands, the Roman citizens themselves. They were a resilient bunch, navigating the complexities of life in a sprawling, sometimes chaotic empire. Sure, they didn't have smartphones or social media, but their lives were no less intricate. They dealt with economic disparities, political machinations, and social hierarchies, much like we do today. They sought entertainment and escapism, clung to community and tradition, and reveled in the shared experience of the games. In many ways, the Romans of the Colosseum era aren't so different from us. They lived in a world of rapid change, where the pace of life was dictated by the whims of emperors and the fortunes of war. They found solace in stories and spectacles, in the rituals that bound them together. And while the Colosseum games were a far cry from our modern entertainments, the underlying desire for connection, for meaning in the midst of chaos, remains the same. It's this continuity, this shared humanity, that makes the Colosseum's legacy so enduring. As much as we might try to distance ourselves from the barbarity of the past, there's something undeniably compelling about this ancient arena and the stories it holds. It's a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of lives and experiences, of triumphs and tragedies that continue to shape who we are. So as you fade into the evening, with the echoes of the Colosseum still resonating in your mind, take a moment to reflect on its significance. The Colosseum stands not just as a monument to Rome's past, but as a testament to the enduring power of human storytelling. It's a place where myth and reality collide, where the lines between history and imagination blur. And in that space, we find not just the stories of long-gone gladiators, but reflections of our own lives, our own struggles, and our own unending quest for meaning. In the end, the Colosseum is more than just a ruin. It's a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, even amidst the chaos and the clamor, life continues. The Romans knew this, and perhaps in their enduring legacy they have something to teach us. That while the world may change, the human spirit, our capacity for creativity, for connection, for endurance, remains. And that, my friend, is a lesson worth remembering as we continue to write our own stories in this vast, unpredictable arena we call life.